Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Joaquin Esquivel. I'm chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. Today is Wednesday, May 3rd. It is 9:30 a.m., and I'd like to bring this meeting back into order. I'll begin by introducing my fellow board colleagues. With me here today virtually is Vice Chair Doreen Diadamo, Board Member Laurel Firestone, and Board Member Sean McGuire. With us virtually as well as our Executive Director, Eileen Sobek, and our one of our chief deputies, Eric Oppenheimer. Our other chief deputy is Jonathan Bishop. He's here in the room with us, along with Michael Lawfer, our chief counsel. Our clerk of the board is Courtney Tyler, and assisting her today is Margie Argel and Michael Reed. As you can see, this is a hybrid meeting. It's being webcast and recorded. For those of you participating virtually, you're either viewing us from our customary webcast on the Cal EPA website or on the YouTube live stream. If you intend on commenting on today's workshop, though, please do ensure that at the top, there are instructions at the top of the agenda on how to get onto the Zoom platform with us. And if you aren't and are still having trouble, please do just email the clerk of the board at board.clerk@waterboards.ca.gov, and she'll help you get onto the platform. Once you're on the platform, your camera will be off. You will be on mute until it is your turn to speak on today's workshop. For those of you in the room, good morning. Good to see you all. We're here in the Cal EPA building in Sacramento. Just quickly observe the exits. If for some reason there is an emergency, we will just calmly file out to Cesar Chavez Plaza and await further directions. Also, if you intend on commenting on the workshop today, please do fill out, there's a QR code in the back to be able to fill out the speaker card. Once you're up, please do give us your name and your organization that you're part of. Also, last but not least, just please do turn off your cell phones for any distractions or noise making devices. Put your phones on silent so that we don't have any distractions during today's discussion. With that, I think we can move on to our workshop, and would like to, today's workshop is on the second revised draft initial biological goals report for the lower San Joaquin River flow objectives. And to kick things off this morning, we have here with us Erin Forsman. Good morning, good to see you.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair Esquivel. Good morning, members of the board. My name is Erin Forsman. I'm an environmental program manager with the Division of Water Rights. I'm here today with Stephen Louie and David Koop and Tina Leahy, and we're here for the workshop item on second revised draft initial biological goals for the lower San Joaquin River. Next slide. This slide is just an agenda for the workshop and the topics we'll be moving through. We're at the beginning, we're at the introduction. On April 10th, we released the second revision to the draft initial biological goals for the lower San Joaquin River. We're in the open comment period now. The comment period closes on May 12th. That's a week from Friday. And we're having this workshop inside the open comment period to allow for staff to provide a presentation to the board and board discussion. There's also an opportunity for public comments. After the introduction, we'll have a staff presentation. We will go through some background material, describe the principles for development of biological goals. The majority of this presentation will be on the biological goals themselves. We'll have a little bit of information about comments and responses. Then we'll have a public comment period, and we'll close the workshop item with information on next steps, including the end of the comment period and how to submit written comments. Next slide. This slide begins the staff presentation, and it's a background information slide for the revised draft biological goals, and it starts with the water quality control plan for the San Francisco Bay, Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta, and we call it the Bay Delta Plan. For those folks who are watching who have been following this topic, this will be familiar information, but we want to include it to be welcoming to people who are newer to this subject area. So the State Water Board adopts the Bay Delta Plan pursuant to requirements in the Federal Clean Water Act and California State Porter Cologne Act. The plan identifies beneficial uses. Those are things like municipal, agricultural, fish and wildlife uses, recreational uses. It also includes narrative and numeric objectives that are intended to provide reasonable protection for those beneficial uses. The Bay Delta Plan also includes the program of implementation, and that's just a section of the Bay Delta Plan that includes a strategy for how the board will achieve the narrative and numeric objectives, as well as reasonable protection of beneficial uses, and it also identifies any needed monitoring and special studies. The Bay Delta Plan is periodically reviewed and updated. In response to fish population declines, the State Water Board considered revisions to the Bay Delta Plan for the lower San Joaquin River and its 3 salmon-bearing tributaries, the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, and the Merced Rivers, for the reasonable protection of fish and wildlife. On December 12th, 2018, the State Water Board adopted new and revised objectives for the lower San Joaquin River, the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, and Merced Rivers. These flow objectives apply from February through June and include narrative and numeric objectives. The February through June objective applies at the tributaries. It includes a requirement for 40% of unimpaired flow within an adaptive range of 30 to 50% from each of the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced Rivers. There's also a minimum base flow objective of 1,000 CFS on the main stem San Joaquin at Vernalis, and that is within an adaptive range of 800 to 1,200 CFS. The program of implementation for lower San Joaquin River flows contains many requirements, 2 of which we'll be talking about today, the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced Working Group, and the requirement to develop biological goals. Draft biological goals were developed in consultation with the Delta Science Program as required by the Bay Delta Plan, and we used a tool with Delta Science Program called an Independent Science Advisory Panel. They provided us a report, and we used that report to develop the first draft biological goals, which were released in 2019 for public comment. Staff reviewed public comments, considered them, and revised the draft initial biological goals and released a first revision in June of 2022. Then we held a technical workshop. We had several other meetings that we'll cover in some following slides. And we, in April of this year, issued a second revised draft biological goals document that's out for public comments right now. Next slide. This slide reviews the Bay Delta Plan requirements for biological goals and the STM working group, the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, Merced working group. So the Bay Delta Plan requires development of biological goals for lower San Joaquin River salmonids and establishes that biological goals for other species may be developed in the future. Biological goals are quantitative metrics that are used for assessing progress toward meeting narrative objectives, which can be accomplished using complementary actions, including flow actions through water right and water quality actions and non-flow actions. The Bay Delta Plan identifies that biological goals will be used for multiple purposes, including informing adaptive implementation methods for flows, evaluating the effectiveness of the program of implementation, lower San Joaquin River flow objectives, and the San Joaquin River monitoring and evaluation program, and informing future changes to the Bay Delta Plan. The biological goals are not intended to address water rights holders' compliance with the Bay Delta Plan. Bay Delta Plan requires biological goals to be developed for abundance, productivity, genetic and life history diversity, and population spatial extent, distribution, and structure. These are metrics that make up the viable salmon population concept. The Bay Delta Plan also identifies a requirement to establish a Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced working group to assist with implementation, monitoring, and effectiveness assessment of the February through June lower San Joaquin River flow requirements. Formation of the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, Merced working group was formalized in June of this year with an invitation from the State Water Board Executive Director to specific organizations that are identified in the Bay Delta Plan and an opportunity for other entities and individuals to request participation in the STM working group. The Bay Delta Plan also requires that the State Water Board seek recommendations from the STM working group on biological goals and other interested persons in consultation with the Delta Science Program. So the Bay Delta Plan identifies that membership and participation in the STM working group should be composed of entities with expertise in lower San Joaquin River, Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced River fisheries, fisheries management, hydrology, operations, and monitoring and assessment needs. The Bay Delta Plan specifically identifies the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, water diverters and users on the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, Merced, and main stem lower San Joaquin River, Water Board staff, and other person or entities the executive director determines to have appropriate expertise. On October 2022, the executive director accepted initial members into the STM working group. And since then, we've conducted 4 STM working group meetings where staff solicited recommendations from STM members and other members of the public on biological goals. Next slide. This slide simply shows a list of the organizations that have requested and been accepted as initial members of the STM working group. It is a diverse group of watershed group members. The organizations and their representatives include diverse interests and expertise, and we will continue to solicit members for the STM working group as needed to provide input on specific topics, including but not limited to traditional ecological knowledge or the development of compliance methods. Next slide. The next 2 slides review the principles that are the basis for developing biological goals. The first principle is that the goals must be science-based. The second principle is that they must be consistent with existing legal requirements, such as Central Valley Project Improvement Act, Fish and Game Code, and Bay Delta Salmon Protection Objective. 2 of these items specifically refer to a requirement to double the natural production of salmon populations in the Central Valley. The next requirement is that the goals meet what we call the SMART requirement, which refers to specific, measurable, achievable, quantitative, results focused, and time bound. So this is how you express the goal and the parameters that you place on the goal. Next, the goals were developed to assess the VSP parameters I mentioned in the previous slide. Those are abundance, production, diversity, genetic and genetic and life history, and the spatial requirements. Next, goals were developed to specifically address San Joaquin salmon. We focused on fall run Chinook for watershed health. Next slide. In addition, we relied on several resources to help us develop the draft biological goals. As I mentioned earlier, we have a report from an independent science advisory panel that was provided to us in 2019. We also accessed and reviewed other efforts to develop biological goals, including the scientific evaluation process that focused initially on the Stanislaus River, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan efforts for establishing goals that were located in the Delta, collaborative science and adaptive management program efforts, which are currently working on a similar effort right now for Central Valley salmonids. The last part of the principles we really want to highlight here are that the goals will be reassessed as additional information is collected using an adaptive management approach, and this assessment would occur at minimum every 5 years. Next slide. So with that, I will transfer over to Steve Louie, who's going to go through the rest of the presentation this morning.
Thanks, Erin. Good morning, Chair SWL and members of the board. My name is Steve Louie, and I am an environmental program manager in the Division Water Rights Bay Delta branch. And I'll start off today discussing the VSP parameters. As required by the Bay Delta Plan, the biological goals were developed for the viable salmonid population, or VSP parameters: abundance, productivity, genetic and life history diversity, and population spatial extent, distribution, and structure. VSP parameters were developed by the National Marine Fisheries Service as guidance for performing assessments of salmon population conservation, status, and viability, because these parameters collectively represent processes that are important to all populations of species. The narrative portion of the lower San Joaquin River flow objective requires that inflow conditions be sufficient to support viable native fish populations. Another key aspect of VSP parameters is that they are measurable, so we can monitor for these indicators and assess whether the board's implementation of the Bay Delta Plan is making progress on the recovery of salmon species. The bullets display the proposed metrics to be used for each of the VSP parameters. For abundance, this escapement is used. For productivity, cohort replacement rate, juvenile survival, and juvenile production are the metrics. For genetic diversity, proportion of hatchery origin spawners is a metric. And for life history diversity, immigration timing, and immigration size classes are the metrics. And finally, for spatial structure, population distribution is a metric. I will describe what these metrics are in later slides. Next slide. Written comments and suggestions from some STM working group members requested more clarity on the application of biological goals and the adaptive implementation, including recommendations for a tiered approach due to, in part, out-of-basin influences on full life cycle goals such as abundance and productivity. To address these comments, the second revised report includes this table and new text to clarify the role of biological goals for allowing board or executive director approval of adaptive implementation options, generally informing adaptive implementation, assessment of the flow requirements in the bid of the plan, and future updates to the plan. The second and third rows of the table contain the most substantial clarifications. The second row proposes to use the tributary juvenile productivity goals to determine whether criteria that allow for board or executive director approval of proposed adaptive implementation actions have been met. The language also proposes that the criteria are met when the best available scientific information indicates 1, expected or documented achievement of the goals, or 2, furtherance of the achievement of the goals. The goals do not have to be met in order to approve adaptive implementation options as long as the best available scientific information indicates furtherance of the goals and that the goals are met in the future with the proposed adaptive adjustments. The third row identifies that the Delta goal for juvenile survival and the lower San Joaquin River juvenile survival information will be used to inform potential water diversion, water right, water quality, or other actions in the main stem, San Joaquin River, and Delta to protect flows and habitat. The remaining rows identify that all goals will be used to inform adaptive implementation options, evaluation of the effectiveness of the lower San Joaquin River flow requirements, the San Joaquin River Monitoring and Evaluation Program, and future updates to the Bay Delta Plan. Next slide. The first biological goal is for the abundance VSB parameter, which is essentially the population size. And it is important because species with larger population sizes have a lower risk of extinction. The abundance goal metric is escapement, which is a number of adult fish that return to the river to spawn. Fundamentally, escapement is an important indicator of a population status and well-being because it integrates all phases of a fish's life cycle from birth to reproduction. Escapement is currently reliably monitored in the Central Valley rivers, and escapement estimates are available near real time. The escapement goal is quantitatively linked to the juvenile survival goals and the salmon protection objective, meaning the goal is the estimated escapement needed in conjunction with the juvenile productivity goal to attain the salmon protection objective. This method, using the quantitative link, is a change from the previous drafts of the biological goals, and this change was a result of the recommendations from many STM working group members. Also, based on recommendation from most STM working group members, only natural origin spawners will contribute to the escapement goal, instead of also including hatchery origin spawners. By only counting natural origin spawners, more focus is put on the actions that benefit the naturally produced juveniles and their subsequent return to spawn in later years. Next slide. This table shows the proposed escapement goals for the lower San Joaquin River tributaries. First and foremost, we would like to see a positive increasing trend in escapement as a 5-year geometric mean. This is consistent with the recommendations of the ISAP. Next in the table are the escapement goals for each of the tributaries that represent the escapement needed to attain the salmon protection objective when paired with the juvenile survival goals. The goal for the Stanislaus River is an escapement of 7,800 spawners, and for the Tuolumne and Merced Rivers, 15,500 and 7,300 spawners, respectively. These escapement goals will be assessed as a 5-year running mean. While the overall goal is a 5-year period, the data will be collected annually, so the data will be assessed annually relative to the anticipated progress. These assessments will not be done in isolation and will incorporate additional information like climatic conditions and hydrological estimates, etc. The attainment target for the Stanislaus and Merced Rivers is 15 years, and for the Tuolumne River, 25 years. And these timelines are based on the population growth rates associated with attaining the juvenile productivity goals and collecting adequate years of data for the calculations. One key point is that high escapement values alone does not mean that we have viable populations, especially if the spawning populations are represented by a large majority of hatchery origin spawners. However, we have the genetic diversity goal that aims to reduce the hatchery influence on the salmon populations. All of the biological goals must work together, and it is assumed that attaining all the goals will be necessary to support self-sustaining viable populations of salmon. Next slide. The following goals are used to track the productivity of salmon populations in the tributaries. Productivity is essentially the population growth rate of a species and an indicator of how well the population replaces itself over time. The first goal is a full life cycle goal and is measured as a cohort replacement rate, or CRR. A cohort replacement rate is a ratio of the number of offspring that return to spawn to the number of parents that produce them. Like the escapement goals, hatchery origin spawners will not be used to contribute to meeting the cohort replacement rate goal, because this goal is an indicator of how well salmon that are spawned in the tributaries can return to spawn. The next productivity goal is an intermediate goal and measures the juvenile survival in fresh water. Salmon have many factors impacting their survival because they spawn in fresh water, migrate hundreds of miles out to the ocean to rear, and they need to return back to the rivers to spawn. As seen in the roles table, juvenile productivity goals will be the primary indicator of tributaries performance and the Bay Delta Plan implementation activities. Current data suggests that juveniles are not surviving well in the rivers because the habitat is not adequate. So this goal sets a minimum freshwater survival rate adequate for viability. Juvenile survival goal is an indicator of the water quality and water habitat conditions that are most directly influenced by water management and restoration activities in the tributaries. And as a result, this is a life stage that best available science shows will result in the greatest improvements to the salmon populations from implementing the lower San Joaquin River flow objectives. Finally, we have the new juvenile production goal, which is added based on input received from SCM working group members. Juvenile goal is complementary to the juvenile survival goal and is the number of juvenile outmigrants necessary to meet the salmon protection objective. The percentage of juvenile survival is expected to decrease as the population increases and approaches the carrying capacity of the rivers. So this metric will allow the juvenile productivity goal to emit through either the percent survival metric or the juvenile production metric. Meeting the juvenile production goal is evidence that the inflow and habitat conditions are providing the carrying capacity sufficient to support the natural production of viable populations. Next slide. Here are the cohort replacement rates for productivity. Fundamentally, the long-term average CRR must be greater than or equal to 1 or the population will be in decline. The first part of the goal is to see a positive increase in CRR until the CRR of greater than 1 is attained as measured as a 5-year geometric mean. There are 2 other cohort replacement rate goals. The second goal is a cohort replacement rate that must be greater than or equal to 1. The second goal is a cohort replacement rate that must be greater than or equal to 1 to have a stable or growing population as represented by the post-fishing CRR, which accounts for the number of spawners in the river and the number of spawners that return to the river. The pre-fishing CRR is an intermediate indicator of how the population is doing by measuring the amount of fish entering the fishery as adults. We expect some fish to be harvested in the fishery, so by assessing the pre-fishing CRR, we can measure if productivity of the population is being impacted before or after the fishery, and whether the fishery is disproportionately impacting the population. The cohort replacement rates will be assessed annually, and the attainment target for the goal is to be attained at year 10. Next slide. This slide shows the juvenile survival goals. The first goal is a positive or increasing trend in juvenile survival until the juvenile productivity goals are met. For example, we would like to see the A to tributary exit survival to increase until this survival is equal to or greater than 10%. Separately, we would like the other survival metrics to increase until those goals are met. Next, the overall freshwater survival goal for each of the tributaries is greater than or equal to 1.5%, which in the long term will allow all the populations to grow and double in about 2 generations. Next, there is the through delta survival goal, which is greater than or equal to 20%. Progress toward this goal will inform actions that may need to be taken in the delta. And finally, we have the new tributary juvenile survival goal based on SDM recommendations, which is the A to tributary exit survival of greater than or equal to 10%. This is the most important goal to measure the tributary performance, as this is the most directly influenced by the implementation of the flow objectives. Similarly, juvenile survival between the tributary confluence and Mossdale will be tracked and evaluated to understand the fate of the juveniles more thoroughly in the lower San Joaquin River. This information will inform any potential actions the State Water Board may need to take to address any disproportionate mortality that may occur in the lower San Joaquin River, as well as the development of survival goals in this reach. As with the previous goals, the juvenile survival will be assessed annually, and the attainment target is year 5 to achieve the survival goal. Chinook salmon inherently have high productivity, and they have evolved to be able to take advantage when presented with favorable conditions. This attainment target reflects that this life stage will most directly be influenced by the implementation of the San Joaquin River flow objectives, as well as that the current populations are critically depressed. Juvenile outmigration survival has been found to be the primary driver in salmon success to adulthood. So as juvenile productivity increases, we expect a commensurate improvement toward meeting the adult goals. However, this also means that progress toward meeting the adult goals in part rely on the positive progress towards meeting the juvenile productivity goals. So there may be a time lag associated with progress toward the adult goals. Next slide. This slide shows the juvenile production goals as an option to meeting the juvenile survival goals for the purposes of attaining the juvenile productivity goals. The goal is essentially the number of juveniles from each tributary estimated to be needed to attain the salmon production objective, assuming current ocean survival estimates. The delta exit goal is calculated by dividing the salmon doubling goal by the ocean survival estimate, and that results in 400,000, 700,000, and 300,000 juveniles for the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced rivers, respectively. The confluence goal is the proportion apportioned to the tributary reach, assuming a total freshwater juvenile survival of 1.5% and a within tributary survival of 10%. This results in goals of 2.7, 4.7, and 2.2 million juveniles exiting the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced rivers, respectively. This juvenile production goal will be assessed on an ongoing basis and can be used to attain the juvenile productivity goal in any year that it is met. Next slide. The next few goals are indicators of population diversity. Diversity is important because variations in a population help it to ensure its survival by contributing to its stability, resilience, and persistence. More diverse populations are at less risk of extinction, for example, from habitat and climate changes, because the diverse populations are able to respond to these changes. Initial biological goals include goals for genetic diversity and for life history diversity. Next slide. First is a goal for genetic diversity because genetically inherited traits create differences among salmon that allow populations to adapt. The genetic diversity is the proportion of hatchery origin spawners that spawn in each of the tributaries, or PHAs. The goal is to reduce the hatchery influence on natural populations because studies have shown that hatchery spawners are less fit than natural populations. For example, their offspring have lower survival rates in the wild. As well, hatchery fish are raised in controlled conditions, so they don't become locally adapted to the conditions in the river. The first genetic goal is a decreasing trend in the percent of hatchery origin spawners. The next two genetic goals reflect the continued progress in improvements in reducing the hatchery influence on salmon populations. Ultimately, the goal is to reduce PHOS to less than or equal to 10% based on literature values and recommendations from the SCM working group. The progress assessment timeline was based on the juvenile productivity goal and resulting expected population and escapement growth rates on the tributaries. So by year 12, PHOS for the basin should be less than 15%, and by year 21, the goal of less than 10% should be attained. These progress assessment timelines are based on increasing the escapement of natural spawners. But if additional actions to reduce hatchery influence are implemented, then the timeline can be reduced. Next slide. The next two goals are indicators of how well the flow and habitat conditions allow the juveniles to express their complete life history diversities, and allow for a diversified portfolio of expressed phenotypes, also known as a portfolio effect. First goal is an indicator of how habitat conditions impact the immigration timing of the juvenile size classes, fry, par, and smolt. Juvenile migration is initiated or triggered by changes in flow, growth rates, and other environmental conditions. The goal will be for each of these size classes to be detected immigrating out of the tributaries each week during the designated time periods, which are similar to the currently observed migration timing. For example, the goal for fry is to see at a minimum a single detection of fry immigrating out of the tributaries during each week starting from the last week of January until the second week of April. Par are older fish than fry, so the goal is a later time period, which is from the first week of February until the last week of May. And finally, the smolt goal is to observe migration from the third week of February until the first week of June. The intent of the goals is not to change the migration patterns of the juveniles, but instead to monitor and ensure that the habitat conditions exist to allow for the population to express their broad diversity of migration patterns. These goals will be assessed annually with considerations for hydrologic and climatic conditions, and the attainment target is year 10 to achieve the goal. Next slide. The final diversity goal is the minimum percentage for size class migration, and these goals are intended to reduce the chance that management of the river systems promote a single size class and to help to enhance the portfolio of life history diversities, which will increase the adaptability and stability of the Chinook salmon populations. These percentages are minimums for each size class, and since they don't add to 100%, the goal allows for flexibility in any given year. Like the immigration diversity goal, the intent of this goal is not to control the distribution of juvenile salmonids, but instead the goal will be used as indicators that habitat conditions are available to support the salmon's complete life history diversities. In wet and above normal water year types, fry and par should each account for 20% or greater of the proportion of juvenile size classes migrating out of the tributaries, and the smolt should make up 10% or greater of the outmigrants. In below normal, dry, and critical water year types, fry should still account for 20%, but the par size class goal increases to 30% or greater, and the smolts increase to 20% or greater. These increases for par and smolts reflects that the current data shows that these typically make up greater proportions during drier years. This goal will be assessed annually, and the attainment target is year 12 to achieve the goal. Next slide. The last initial biological goal is for spatial structure. Like life history diversity, a broad geographic distribution of salmon populations or subpopulations helps to distribute risks to the overall population and reduces the risk of extinction. For example, a catastrophic event in one of the tributaries could devastate the aquatic habitat and salmon populations. Having multiple robust salmon populations in neighboring watersheds will assist in the ability for salmon populations to recolonize once adequate conditions are restored. The initial spatial structure goal is to attain the abundance, productivity, and diversity goals in each of the 3 tributaries. Next slide. Recommendations from the SDM working group during the first 3 SDM meetings were considered collectively with the previous comments received, information from the 2019 Independent Science Advisory Panel, the August 2022 Technical Workshop Expert Panel, and the requirements of the state and federal laws and the Bay Delta Plan, which resulted in the second revised draft initial biological goals. The proposed second revised biological goals were presented to the SDM working group during the April 21st meeting to receive any initial feedback from SDM members. This slide reviews some of the initial feedback that we received. As described earlier, clarifications on how the biological goals were going to be used were added to the report that helps to identify the roles and uses for each of the specific biological goals. While some SDM members appreciated the additional clarification, some SDM members opposed the roles because they considered it a restriction on the uses for the biological goals. It uses just one group of the viability parameters instead of all the parameters to represent a continuum of the life stages that are connected. The reason for the proposed roles is that the juvenile production goals are most directly and immediately affected by the total tributary flow volume and pattern. Other water rights or water quality actions in the lower San Joaquin River and Delta may be taken to address survival in those reaches. Accordingly, the juvenile tributary goals are the goals that staff have proposed to be used as the evaluation criteria that allow the executive director or the board to approve an adaptive implementation adjustment proposal. Next, for the abundance goal, we received objections to the use of escapement because the goals should instead reflect the attainment of the plan's narrative objectives. For example, ocean production for the salmon protection objective or juvenile abundance as a measure of juvenile viability. Revised report provides rationale for escapement. Staff still propose the use of escapement because it is one of the most reliably monitored metrics for salmon populations, much more so than ocean production, but we don't currently have a reliable estimate. Using juvenile abundance for the abundance goal would be redundant with the juvenile productivity goal, and it would eliminate one of the multiple lines of evidence of population status, adult abundance, and the associated population dynamics and forces on adult populations. We also received feedback at the April SDM meeting that the juvenile survival goal was too low to represent viability. Instead of the 1.5% freshwater survival goal, the SDM member recommended that we use 2.2% survival based on the Stanislaus River scientific evaluation processes resilience goal for juvenile survival. While the 1.5 survival goal is much lower than the average survival seen for other West Coast Chinook salmon populations, the 1.5% goal is proposed because it represents an achievable improvement over current survival conditions and is calculated to be a level that will produce a growing self-sustaining population. The next issue that we received feedback on at the April SDM meeting was a concern that the abundance and productivity goals were not achievable on the Stanislaus River due to carrying capacity limitations, and that the carrying capacity for juvenile salmon in the spawning segment of the Stanislaus River the carrying capacity for juvenile salmon in the spawning segment of the Stanislaus River upstream of the Oakdale rotary trap is not influenced by flow. While there was general appreciation that the escapement goals were modified to a more reasonable value, the SCM member felt that staff did not respond sufficiently to the concern that the abundance and productivity goals lack considerations for density dependence and the concern that the carrying capacity of the upper river above Oakdale was not influenced by flow. This is in contrast to the water board staff's and others' findings that show that increased flow increases the carrying capacity of the lower portion of the Stanislaus River down to the confluence with the lower San Joaquin River. We heard in the April SCM meeting that the issue of carrying capacity limitations were brought up to us in previous comments and during the previous SCM meetings and the August 2022 biological goals technical workshop, and that staff have ignored this issue. We want to be responsive to the comments, so the next few slides will address this concern in detail in an effort to provide a more comprehensive and explicit response to the comment about carrying capacity and achievability of the proposed juvenile production goal. Discussing carrying capacity of the rivers is important for understanding attainability of the goals. So we will walk through the aspects of carrying capacity and how the implementation of the Bay Delta Plan and Program of Implementation is anticipated to increase the carrying capacity of the rivers. Next slide. The issue that we heard was that the carrying capacity of the Stanislaus River was limited to producing a maximum of 1.5 million juveniles because the habitat on the Stanislaus River upstream of Oakdale was unable to produce more than 1.5 million juveniles. This is a relevant concern because if the river is limited to producing 1.5 million juveniles, then the juvenile abundance goal of 2.7 million juveniles would be unattainable. This is a chart from a publication from Pilger and others, where the authors evaluated 5 different methods for calculating the estimated abundance of juveniles able to be produced upstream of Oakdale and immigrate downstream. The red line depicts an abundance of 1.5 million juveniles, and you can see from the chart that 1.5 million juveniles is clearly exceeded in multiple years. And multiple methods estimate that over 4 million juveniles can be produced in the Stanislaus River upstream of Oakdale. In all, about 1/4 of the years exceed 1.5 million juveniles. So the production of 1.5 million juveniles is not the maximum carrying capacity of the river. Next slide. Next, we heard that we would be unable to increase the carrying capacity of the river upstream of Oakdale because flow was not a determinant of juvenile abundance and because the limiting factor upstream of Oakdale was limited physical habitat. This slide shows a couple of charts that were produced by the Independent Science Advisory Panel and included in the ISAP's recommendations on biological goals. These are the results of stock recruitment model analyses that were conducted on Oakdale data provided to the ISAP by FishBio, the environmental consulting firm that conducts much of the salmon monitoring in the Stanislaus and Tuolumne rivers. The left chart shows a statistical relationship between January through March flows on the x-axis and the abundance of juveniles past Oakdale on the y-axis. So as flow increases in the river, we see an associated increase in juvenile abundance. And there is an estimated 3-fold increase in abundance across the range of flow conditions. These results from the Independent Science Panel contradict the statement that the carrying capacity of the river upstream of Oakdale cannot be increased with flow management. One thing to note about the charts is that the y-axis abundance numbers represent the par and smolt size classes only and do not include the abundance of the fry size class. In the Stanislaus River, on average, fry make up about 50% of the total abundance of juveniles. So the abundances in these charts represent less than 1/2 the total yearly juvenile abundance. The right chart shows the results of the ISAP's stock recruitment analysis of October through November water temperatures on the x-axis versus juvenile abundance the next spring on the y-axis. What they found was that juvenile abundance increased as water temperatures during the early egg incubation period decreased. The model saw a 10-fold increase in juvenile abundance to the range of temperature conditions, which suggests that the carrying capacity to produce juveniles is also affected by the temperature management, which is largely controlled by reservoir storage. This finding really highlights the importance of cold water temperatures and cold water storage in the reservoirs during the fall to produce the viability of eggs in the spawning females and the eggs developing in the gravel. This relationship is also an important consideration during the Bay Delta Plan's implementation process for allocating responsibility for approving adaptive implementation adjustments and the potential need for shifting the water budget outside the February through June period. There are three key takeaways from the Independent Science Advisory Panel's model. First, the carrying capacity of the Stanislaus River above Oakdale can be increased using non-physical habitat actions, such as flow management. Second, juvenile abundance is controlled by multiple disparate actions, and we may not maximize the benefits of improved spring flow conditions if suitable conditions are not available in the fall and winter spawning period. And finally, having multiple actions influence juvenile abundance is encouraging because we have multiple tools to improve the conditions for salmon populations, such as spring flow increases, cold water management actions, and flow shifting options to manage temperatures during the spawning season. As well, the different actions act on the species in sequence. So improvements to the conditions can result in abundance increases that are multiplicative. For example, hypothetically, if improved conditions in the fall can improve the number of surviving eggs by 3 times, and then spring habitat conditions can improve the survival of juveniles of those eggs by 2 times, then the combined improvements could result in 6-fold increases in survival. Additional improvements to the physical habitat could improve survival even further. Next slide. This slide shows some of the results of the Water Board staff's stock recruitment model that was included in the biological goals report. This chart shows the relationship between the Stanislaus River adult spawner abundance on the x-axis and the subsequent juvenile abundance exiting the river the next spring on the y-axis. This differs from the ISAP's model in that the staff modeled the abundance of juveniles leaving the tributary versus the ISAP modeled the abundance of juveniles exiting the upper portion of the river. The multiple colored lines represent the predicted juvenile abundance with increasing flow variability during February through June, from lower variability in the darker colors to higher variability in the lighter colors. This suggests that the carrying capacity of the river as a whole can be increased with flow management in the river, even at spawner abundances that exceed the abundance goal for the Stanislaus River. Combined with the ISAP analyses, we have multiple independent analyses showing consistently that the carrying capacity in the upper river and the river as a whole can be improved with flow management. The biological goals report includes additional stock recruitment models that evaluate flow volume and water temperature during the spring for the Stanislaus and Tuolumne rivers, and all found that increased flow volume or variability or decreased water temperatures were associated with increased juvenile abundance or carrying capacity. The analysis in this chart predicts that the river can support an abundance of 5 million juveniles at the highest flow variability value and at 8,000 spawners. Next slide. This slide shows another example of flow-mediated carrying capacity in the Stanislaus River by measuring the number of juveniles per spawners exiting the Stanislaus River. The left chart shows that juveniles per spawner increase on the y-axis as flow variability increases on the x-axis. This analysis is analogous to the stock recruitment model shown on the previous slide, and the results are consistent. More flow variability was associated with increased juvenile abundance and carrying capacity. However, in the right chart, this study also evaluated how flow variability during the juvenile rearing period on the x-axis influenced the number of adults that returned to spawn years later on the y-axis. What the study found was that increased flow variability was associated with an increase in the number of adult recruits per spawner. Adult recruits per spawner is essentially cohort replacement rate, So flow management during the juvenile life stage results in benefits to the full life cycle of the species. Furthermore, the authors found that the characterization of flow patterns that the returning adults experienced as juveniles suggested that juvenile abundance was constrained by suppressed winter flow cues. What that means is that the Stanislaus River flow regime was often characterized by low winter flows that did a poor job of supporting the fitness of fry migrants, as well as delayed the timing of other migrants. This is important for understanding the carrying capacity of the river. As I mentioned earlier, we were told that the limited physical habitat in the upstream reach of the Stanislaus River constrained a juvenile abundance because the carrying capacity was reached. Physical habitat is one aspect of carrying capacity. For example, the acreage of rearing habitat or the acreage of spawning habitat could limit abundance. Then other aspects of habitat like flow volume, velocity, temperature, contaminants, or other species can influence the suitability of that habitat further. This concept of suppressed winter flow cues and delayed migration highlights another aspect of carrying capacity, and that is the temporal aspect of carrying capacity. Delaying the migration of juveniles into spring results in increased densities of juveniles in the upstream habitats of the river, which results in an abundance of juveniles that reaches the carrying capacity of the habitat and increasing the influence of density-dependent factors. If the river hydrology was instead more similar to natural conditions and exhibited winter pulses that corresponded to winter storms, then the migrants would be cued to outmigrate earlier, thus making the upstream habitats available for other developing juveniles to use. Think of the analogy of a factory conveyor belt, but instead of producing TVs and cell phones sequentially, the rivers can mass produce juvenile salmon by pushing out cohorts of migrants by utilizing the natural diversity of Chinook salmon. 1 million fry can be pulsed out in late winter. A mix of size classes can be pulsed out in early spring. In late spring, larger smolts can be pulsed out. Not only will the pulses cue migration, but the larger flow volumes of water and higher velocities will also help the immigrants to survive their downstream journey by providing cooler temperatures, greater food resources, more bank inundation, higher turbidity, reduced predation risk, etc. Density-dependent factors and limitations due to carrying capacity can be ameliorated by managing the flow in the rivers similar to natural conditions. We have only discussed carrying capacity in regards to the Stanislaus River. These concepts should also apply to the Tuolumne River and Merced River. On the Tuolumne River, staff's stock recruitment model found that flow management was positively related to carrying capacity in the Tuolumne River. The Merced River did not have the data available to perform a stock recruitment analysis, but we don't have evidence that the Merced River and salmon populations would be inconsistent with the other two tributaries. Next slide. This concludes the staff's presentation. We would like to answer any questions from the board members and then allow for public comment.
Thank you. I really appreciate the presentation and the unpacking of what I know has been a lot of good engagement and feedback in the STEM group, and then here better unpacking it for public discourse. I don't have any questions. I'm eager to hear the feedback from our commenters. I know we have a number, but I'm looking to my colleagues in case they have questions off the bat. Okay. And looking to Vice Chair as well. Okay.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. This work is incredibly critical. We're in the middle of, I know, a lot of uncertainty in the systems that we're trying here to manage. And so the ability to really synthesize and have best biological goals that frame up the where we are in our project, where and here be able to really begin to understand the impact of actions. You know, I think back to certainly the Cal Fed days, and you know, there were projects like the Vernalis adaptive management programs and others that if we had better metrics and goals around, you know, maybe could have had better data around as well. And so this work is really important. I really appreciate it. I think I do have one question, and it's really about the applicability of this work to then the Sacramento and the Delta. As we know, these biological goals are related to the lower San Joaquin and phase one of our project, if you will. And knowing that, a lot of this work is about the specifics and the carrying capacity and the status of these tributaries, still yet wondering though, how we might see this work even in the discussion around the Sacramento standards and the Delta, because knowing that that's also a big priority. And here again, we're talking about the lower San Joaquin and want to focus folks on that project and these goals, but wondering what is the applicability largely to, again, the standard setting on the Sacramento and the Delta. Will this be all work that we're able to then really move into those spaces with as well? Or is it kind of having to restart a bit of it, wanting to better understand the cross-pollination between it?
Well, there are a couple issues. First, so many of the populations of salmon up there could use the same metrics for biological goals. The values would be different because the carrying capacity could be different. But another aspect is that the Delta species will probably require whole new goals, or at least maybe use the concept of VSP, but they're not directly relatable completely. And so we'll probably have to develop new goals for the Sac Delta on the Delta species.
That's helpful. More applicable to obviously the Sacramento and its tributaries here, and the salmonids we're largely talking about. There's a lot of estuarine species then in the Delta that we'd stop to develop further those, but at least the applicability is there for some of the project.
I just wanted to add that it would be, I think, very straightforward to do the same exercise for fall run Chinook, Sacramento fall run Chinook, and the same methods could be used for the other migratory species. But again, just reinforce that the estuarine species could be a different approach. They may need to be, but I think it would be a fairly fast exercise for fall run on the Sacramento.
That's great to hear. I appreciate that, and hopefully helpful for folks as they engage with this to understand that it helps the entire project as we move forward as well. Okay, let's go ahead and move to our commenters. I'll take folks in order of received, and I think there's some folks still kind of trickling in. If there are those of you that are listening in currently on the live stream and you're looking to comment on this item, you need to be on the Zoom platform. Again, there are instructions at the top of the agenda. If you're having challenges, email the board clerk at board.clerk@waterboards.ca.gov. Right now, we have about 17 commenters, just for everyone's sense on timing. And we'll start to scroll, as you can see, folks on here. It looks like our first few commenters aren't yet on the platform. And so we will get to, I think our first is Andrea Fuller. Or are the others, sorry, are they?
So our first commenter should be Mr. James Lynch, and he is on the platform.
I apologize. I thought the cross next to folks meant that they weren't on the platform currently. Sorry. James Lynch will be our first commenter, and then afterwards will be Ashley Overhouse.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us today and listening to me. I'm Jim Lynch, a fishery biologist with HCR Incorporated, and I'm speaking here today on behalf of Merced Irrigation District. My comments today are general in nature, and Merced Irrigation District intends to provide written comments to the State Board staff by May 12th. Merced ID appreciates the State Board staff holding additional SCM working group meetings to discuss biological goals, as Merced ID and other SCM working group members requested, and also appreciates the staff stating today that it plans to continue to consult with the SCM working group. We encourage these continuing and meaningful dialogue. Further, based on this meeting, staff has clarified that the biological goals are not intended to be used to document compliance with the Bay Delta Plan. We appreciate that. However, we are concerned that their goals may be used, at least in part, to modify flow releases from the Merced River in some undefined fashion at this time. We are especially concerned because we find the goals to be laudable aspirational goals, but unlikely to be attained without other significant actions, such as hatchery reform, addressing physical habitat limitations, predator control, as well as limiting ocean harvest, all of which are significant limiting factors and are mentioned in the biological goals report, but all of which are outside the Bay Delta Plan to control. In addition, We are concerned that the biological goals report is disturbingly vague concerning how all the data needed to track these goals on the 3 San Joaquin tributaries will be collected in a timely fashion, and how a reliable report will be produced in a timely fashion to make meaningful and measurable adaptive management adjustments, let alone whether the funding needed for such an aggressive, effective monitoring program is reliably in place. I have one additional comment today, specifically in response to State Water Board staff's presentation. The Stanislaus was mentioned quite a bit today. I'm not an expert on the Stanislaus, and I'll defer to those experts. But I believe during our STM working group meetings, the Stanislaus experts did present historical data that demonstrated that basically flow does not result in more salmon on the Stanislaus. And that's something I'll leave for the Stanislaus people to address directly, either in their comments today or in their written responses. With that, thank you for your time, and we look forward to filing written comments.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Look forward to those comments and continued engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to call up Ashley Overhouse, who will be followed by Brett Baker.
Thank you, Chair Esquivel. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. So good board members and staff, thank you so much for this workshop and the opportunity to give comment. Ashley Overhouse with Defenders of Wildlife. And I'd like to thank the board again for taking this input into the biological goals, once again for the update of phase 1 and the opportunity to comment. Many of my colleagues, including Dr. John Rosenfield, will elaborate on these comments. But first and foremost, these biological goals must reflect attainment within a reasonable period of both the plan's narrative salmon doubling objectives and the plan's narrative fish viability objective. So as board staff mentioned at the beginning of their presentation, this means the goals must be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant to the plan objectives, and time-bound. In other words, SMART. From that point of view, this draft of biological goals are still deficient because first and foremost, the proposed goal for overall juvenile freshwater survival of 1.5%, see table 3-3, is far less than that associated with viability. And so not close to the species-wide average juvenile survival for the Chinook salmon. And then second, these goals are still deficient because the proposed adult escapement goals, table 3-1, are arbitrary and do not reflect attainment of the plan objective for doubling natural production, and we believe must be adjusted. So currently the escapement goals reflect a precondition to achieving the plan objective, not actual attainment of the target. They're also redundant of the juvenile production goal. So the current adult escapement targets add really nothing of value and are likely to distract from measures needed to satisfy plan objectives. And then target attainment of something less than the doubling objective in a future that is far too distant. The 25-year timeline for the Tuolumne is an unacceptably long delay. Assuming this part of the plan is implemented tomorrow, Chinook salmon in the Tuolumne would not even reach the doubling objective in 2048. For context, this is 18 years past the 30 by 30 goals, 8 years past Sigma compliance, and 3 years past SB 100 goals. This delay reflects the inadequate goal for juvenile survival, which results in very slow population growth. But all that being said, I would still like to thank board staff for improvements in these biological goals. We are really appreciative that they exclude the effect of hatchery spawners, as hatchery origin fish are not relevant to the plan objectives for double natural production of Chinook salmon. And it corrects the hatchery influence target, reducing the allowable hatchery influence to be in line with published targets for viability. So again, grateful for the input and the opportunity to comment today. Thank you, board staff, for all of your work and the STM group in revising these biological goals.
Thank you, Ms. Overhouse. I appreciate, again, your engagement as well. And here, I appreciate the acknowledgement of changes that were helpful. And again, I appreciate the back and forth here on the balance of if we've gotten this right. And so just thanks for the engagement. I believe Brett Baker is not on the platform, and so we'll go next to William Sears. And Mr. Baker, if you're viewing through one of the webcasts, please do email the clerk.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel and members of the board. My name is William Sears. I'm a science and policy analyst at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. Today, I'm providing some brief comments on behalf of the Tuolumne River Partners, which consists of San Francisco, the Turlock Irrigation District, and the Modesto Irrigation District. The Tuolumne River Partners wish to thank State Board staff for organizing the STM working group. It's been a really great experience for us and for hosting the series of meetings on the biological goals. And we really appreciate that staff have incorporated several of our comments into the plan, the document, including some important changes that focus on the roles of certain biological goals. We feel that those changes really better focus the biological goals on the in-river juvenile fall run Chinook life stages that the Bay Delta Plan will directly affect, versus those life stages that are subject to out-of-basin influences that the Bay Delta Plan does not address, like off-site hatchery releases or unsustainable harvest practices. And while we may agree with the biological appropriateness or relevance of certain biological goals, at this time we're not prepared to agree that this process or the goals are legally or procedurally valid. So again, we wish to thank the State Board staff for their work on the biological goals and their outreach to the STM working group. We'll provide more detailed written comments by the May 12th deadline. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you for the engagement and input, Mr. Sears. Appreciate the participation in the group, even if maybe still some fundamental disagreements exist.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to call up Andrea Fuller. Good to see you in person. Good morning. You may need to turn on the microphone there at the very top. There should be a button that. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Good morning.
Good morning, Chair Esquivel, and good to see you in person as well. Board members, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to talk further about the revised biological goals. I'm here today on behalf of Oakdale and South San Joaquin irrigation districts, and my comments will focus primarily on the Stanislaus River. If we could go. So an overview of the brief slides that I will be presenting today is first reviewing areas of improvement in the draft goals, then discussing achievability of the productivity goals on the Stanislaus. And finally, the assumed ability to meet the goals appears to lead to some unrealistic expectations that were presented as part of the appendices. I'd like to touch on that. If we could go to the next slide, please. So as many folks commented on already, this is a very important, I think, improvement to the biological goals of being able to tie what's going on in the tributaries to the actions that are being taken in the tributaries. So very much appreciated to see this clarification and direct tie of actions in the tributaries to metrics in the tributaries. Slide, please. As folks have also commented on, the focus on natural origin is of significance. We're looking to improve productivity within these streams, and at least in the Stanislaus, we have no hatchery in the stream. We're not interested in encouraging hatchery fish into our stream. We're looking at how many fish can we produce from the Stanislaus. But there's still concern that in going forward and managing for natural origin fish in the stream, that there is a strong need for increasing the number of hatchery fish that are marked. In particular, 100% marking would be a significant benefit to be able to readily identify fish as being of hatchery origin. Right now, with the constant fractional marking program, we're still waiting for data for returns from the 2020 season. So we're 3 years behind in being able to understand what fraction of the population returning to the San Joaquin tributaries is of hatchery origin. That's also of importance for potential management actions in the future if we were to look to potentially exclude or segregate hatchery origin fish from natural origin fish.
What's the current percentage of hatchery fish that are marked? Have their adipose
about 25%.
25.
So helpful. It's been a step in the right direction, but I think that more could certainly be done and allow for that more real-time understanding and interpretation and management. The adult abundance goal that has been revised for the Stanislaus is now a lower target and is more in line with what we believe the carrying capacity to be of the system based on our estimates of adult abundance at the Counting Weir and the juveniles produced at the Oakdale Screw Trap. I very much appreciate the acknowledgement of density dependence in the Stanislaus. Was encouraged to see that in the revised report, and even more encouraged today to hear Mr. Louie speak to that in more depth. In some areas, it may seem like we're in a lot of disagreement, but honestly, in seeing what was presented today, in some cases, I think that there's probably more agreement than we would think when we start to parse this into different life stages and different times of year and try to decouple the influences of flow and water temperature, et cetera. So I was very encouraged to see the additional effort put into that today.
I really appreciate that because I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that especially around a lot of the science and discourse that's out there, there's a lot more agreement and we know a lot more here. And so being able to synthesize and have that trust means a lot. So I appreciate that comment from you.
We could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit more. What we have here is just to kind of orient folks to the Stanislaus River and the different reaches of the river. On the left-hand side, you see the San Joaquin River, the mouth of the Stanislaus River, and moving on up to Goodwin Dam, which is the terminal extent that anadromous fish can reach. We're very fortunate on the Stanislaus to have a long history of monitoring data available to us. There's about 25 years of rotary screw trap monitoring to estimate juveniles at 2 different locations. There's also a Counting Weir that's been in operation for about 20 years now, providing a long history of direct counts. So what we have is the ability to look at adult fish moving into the system, get direct counts of those fish moving into the spawning reach, so we know how many fish are spawning. And then we have the Oakdale rotary screw trap that is located just downstream of where the majority of the production is occurring. So these are fish that are beginning their migration downstream. And then you have another 30 miles or so to the Caswell rotary screw trap, which is near the confluence. It's about 10 miles from the confluence. So we have the ability here to segregate what's going on, or segregate interpretation of what's going on in the upper reach and the spawning and rearing reach versus the migratory reach down below, where you don't have fish spawning, you may have fish rearing, but you have different processes and different life stages that are supported at different times in these reaches. We could go to the next slide, please. So again, I don't want to beat this up too bad because I think that we are actually getting some more consideration now of the the habitat issue, but wanted to kind of relate this back to what I had seen in the supplement to the scientific basis report in support of the VAs. Recently. And there's a strong habitat emphasis or focus in that document, tying it back to what habitat do you need to support doubling. And that seems out of sync with the focus on the San Joaquin. And what I did was I looked at, if we have the goal of 7,800 adult spawners on the Stanislaus, and we assume that 60% of those are female spawners, which is consistent with State Board staff's analysis. We multiply that by the fecundity, and then a 38% egg to fry survival is what is being assumed in the supplement report. And that's also in keeping or consistent with what the Stanislaus evaluation process found. 35% being a typical egg to fry survival. That being the case, we'd need enough habitat to support 9 million fry produced on the Stanislaus River. That's 9 million fry in that spawning and rearing reach beginning their journey. If we could go to the next slide, please. And so this is what we see when we plot the number of female spawners that we've observed on the x-axis against the number of juveniles produced at Oakdale on the y-axis. As Mr. Louie had presented earlier, one of our recent papers had several different methods by which juvenile production was estimated. They all generally followed the same trend, but had different point estimates. The preferred model that emerged from that was the Bayesian model, and that is the numbers that you are seeing here representing the Oakdale rotary screw trap production. So plotting this against the confluence goal of 2.7 million juveniles, you can see that the highest observed estimated abundance at Oakdale has been about 2.7 million juveniles. But if we look at the carrying capacity curve, we're looking at a limitation of more like 1.3 to 1.5 million juveniles produced out of the spawning reach. If we go to the next slide, this is looking at the years by water year type, and we've grouped together dry years and wet years. And you can see that there is a slight signal there that is insignificant, not statistically significant, but it doesn't come out as statistically significant in the models, but does suggest that there could be some improvement or some higher value, slightly higher value, but still we're talking about between 1.3 to 1.5 million. So this isn't a big difference. And when you relate that back to the previous numbers that I had calculated based on the approach for what should be supported in the based on the Sacramento or the supplement numbers, we'd be looking to support 9 million fish. So it's a huge discrepancy between what we're seeing here in observed ability, observed capacity relative to what the capacity of the system may need to be to support the objectives. And one kind of off-track note that I think is important is the majority of the juveniles produced at Oakdale are fry. These are fish that are leaving the system early in the year, primarily in the February timeframe. About 83%, pretty consistent, pretty tight relationship around that mean, leaves the system every year. So you're talking about fish that are probably not being as influenced by flow during that short time period as perhaps the par and smolt are later in the year when they're migrating. So they're rearing in the river longer. And I think that speaks to some of the information that Mr. Louie presented earlier that was focused on the later life stages that are in that segment of the river longer and are also in much, much lower abundance than the fry that are dominating the outmigration. Next slide, please. So looking at this a different way, this is relating to the egg to juvenile survival objective now. So looking for a 10% egg to juvenile survival at Caswell. But this is plotting egg to juvenile survival at Oakdale of 10%. And you can see that there are years that we get above that 10%, but on average, we're at about 7% egg to juvenile survival at Oakdale. So even if all of those fish survived down to Caswell, we still wouldn't achieve the goal. We're not meeting it to Oakdale 30 miles upstream. Slide, please. Quotes that come from the SEP report, which has been identified and cited many times regarding habitat need. Increases in the number of returning spawners will require additional habitat area. That was recognized by the SEP. The Stanislaus does not have the ability to replenish more gravel through its own natural processes. That's being blocked behind the dams. And there will not be enough habitat for adult spawners unless substantial restoration efforts are made. And if we could go to the next slide, we can get a sense for how much degradation has occurred in the Stanislaus and how much progress we're making towards adding additional habitat. So on the left there, we have the number of cubic yards, and you'll see that there's a positive scale and a negative scale. So the negative scale is the cumulative cumulative cubic yards that were extracted prior to the year 2000. So about 1 million cubic yards of material was extracted from the active channel. And when you go out on the Stanislaus, it's very obvious. You see these long dredged out runs that have no value for spawning fish or for generating food for fish. Then the supply has been further reduced. And if we just look at the last 10 years, we're looking at about 250,000 cubic yards of material that has likely been captured behind dams and is not being introduced to the system below. In contrast, over that same time period, only about 36,000 cubic yards of material has been added. The majority of that material is added every year at one of the most heavily used spawning riffles, which is a good thing, but it also has a lifespan of 1 year. So as soon as we see the first pulse flow, that gravel moves downstream and is gone. So we're very far from maintaining, let alone restoring, the spawning habitat in the Stanislaus River. We could go to the next slide. So to put into perspective, in the appendices, there are some calculations that are used in part to determine the timeframes for when objectives would be expected to be met. I've plotted here the projections for the Stanislaus for each of the generations going out to 7 generations. The Stanislaus goal is the first line that you see there. So you can see that, as Mr. Louis said earlier, that you're reaching that goal in 1 to 2 generations very quickly if those objectives were met. And if you summed up the entire San Joaquin Basin goal, it would appear that the Stanislaus would be achieving more than that goal by year 12. And then it really goes off the charts, getting up to a level projected to approach the Sacramento Basin capacity. I understand that these are simple projections, but it's disturbing to me that there was not more consideration to, at some point, there is a carrying capacity, and at some point, it's clearly lower than the numbers that were here. And these are the numbers that were used to identify the timeframes in which the goals would be expected to be achieved. So it appears that they are a population explosion and over a time period that is completely unrealistic. That was the last slide. And I just want to say thank you. And again, thank you for the additional attention of State Board staff to providing more information regarding the density dependence. And I look forward to more dialogue on that issue.
Likewise, really appreciate the presentation, Ms. Fuller, and the engagement around it. Vice Chair. Yeah, I think the Vice Chair may have a question.
Can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you. The question that I had was, Ms. Fuller, first of all, thank you for your engagement. And I'll just use this as an opportunity to thank all the stakeholders. I sat in on a number of the meetings and was just really impressed with the good discussion. Ms. Fuller, my question is related to, you mentioned the 9 million fry appendices, but also the supplemental report for the scientific basis for the VAs. And so I'm just wanting to make sure I understand which report are you critiquing as it relates to the biological goals that are before us?
2, I guess. The first reference to the supplement was if you use the same approach that was used in the supplement to get to a number of spawners or juveniles that you would need to support to meet the doubling goal. By that logic, we should have enough habitat to support 9 million juveniles being produced by the goal for escapement. So 7,800 escaping adults, 60% of those are females, would be expected to produce 9 million juveniles using the logic, using the calculations that were presented in the supplement report. The second piece, the second piece, yes, the second piece of it, which was the last slide that I had shown, those projections come from the appendices to the latest revised biological goals. So the calculations for what would be expected to occur if the biological goals are achieved.
All right. And then do you see a relationship or an implication other than you looking at the supplemental report and arriving at your conclusions with respect to that report? Do you see a connection between the appendices and the biological goals and that supplemental report?
Question exactly. In the supplement report and in those projections, we're projecting that many more fish could be produced or be supported than what our data is telling us the system has capacity to support.
Yes, understood. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And thank you, Ms. Fuller. Next, I'd like to call up Gary Bobker, who will be followed by Peter Dreckmeyer. Morning, Mr. Bobker.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and the other members of the board. My name is Gary Bobker. I'm the program director at the Bay Institute. As you know, TBI has been intensively involved in helping to develop and to spur the adoption of biological goals and objectives in the water quality control plan and other venues. And we're pleased that the board decided to include BGOs in the water quality control plan. We think that the succession of drafts, shows progress and includes a number of good proposed BGOs, many of which reflect the best available science as reflected in the scientific evaluation process report and other sources. And we strongly support the foundational principle of using SMART objectives, although in the board staff's presentation that SMART seemed to be a little bit mangled. The main points that I would like to communicate to you about the status of the draft BGOs. First is that those BGOs need to be consistent with the narrative objective of viability and the narrative objective of salmon doubling. And my primary concern is that your freshwater survival, proposed freshwater survival goal falls short of that. I think Stephen Louie said in the staff presentation that, in responding to feedback they'd gotten from STEM members, was that the lower freshwater survival rate was chosen by board staff because it would improve conditions over the status quo. But that is not the threshold that the board has set. It is not the threshold that the board is obligated to meet. The threshold here is viability and salmon doubling. If you go with the lower freshwater survival rate, what you're essentially saying is that you're writing off the San Joaquin tributaries as not being able to support viable salmonid populations. And I don't think you want to do that. So I'd strongly recommend it, that staff reconsider that lower survival rate and take a look at something more consistent with other salmonid populations elsewhere in the Central Valley. Also concerned about assumptions about achieving salmon doubling over a longer period of time, like 25 years. We know that if you improve conditions for salmonids, if you remove the stressors on salmonid population growth, that growth will occur. The capacity for that growth is actually quite explosive. In good conditions, salmon can do more than double. So again, I think that assumption of a much longer milestone for achievement of salmon doubling is neither consistent with the science nor with the mandate that the board has to achieve doubling. There are other concerns, I think, that were expressed about escapement. I think John Rosenfield will speak to that later. The second major point I wanted to make is in regard to the role that BGOs play. And Chairman Esquivel, you asked, a good question about how relevant are these to what I still call phase two, the development of the Sacramento and Delta objectives. And I think there's two things that need to be said about that. The first is that the biological goals and objectives are really, they put flesh on the skeleton of viability. They put flesh on the skeleton of salmon doubling. These are narrative objectives. And the more that we're able to actually provide measurable outcomes associated with those, the more meaningful they are. So you should have biological goals and objectives available to you as you consider what the water quality objectives should be, and as you consider what the adaptive management range around those objectives should be. So you should actually be developing the biological goals and objectives for Sacramento Valley salmonids and for estuarine species now. They should be available to you, and you can do that. There's plenty of information out there to do that. You could be using them right now to shape your phase two decision. And the failure to do so means that you're going to be in the same position you are now, which is that after having adopted lower San Joaquin objectives and set a range, you're now considering adopting biological goals and objectives, which you may not be able to meet because you've already constrained yourself by the decisions you've made as to what the requirements and adaptive range are for the lower San Joaquin River. And you want to avoid boxing yourself in like that in phase two. So, so learn from what where we are now. Use the vast amount of information that's already available that allows us to expeditiously set biological goals and objectives for estuarine species and for all South Central Valley migratory species, and use that to make the best decision in phase two. Thank you for the ability to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Bobker. I appreciate your contributions and input on this component of the work and the project writ large. So thank you. I'll just note we have been going for about an hour and a half, and since this is the only item today, I want to give us the luxury of a break. So I do want to take about a 15-minute break here, but let's go ahead and have a couple more folks come up, and then we'll take a quick 15 and then get back into commenters. Next, I'd like to call up Peter Dreckmeyer, and since David Ragland is also part of the Tuolumne River Trust, let's have them go, and then that brings us to then our 8th commenter. We have 16 total, so we still have another 8 after that. So it'll be a good point to break. So Peter Dreckmeyer.
Thank you, Chair Esquivel and board members. My name is Peter Dreckmeyer. I'm the policy director for the Tuolumne River Trust. I appreciate all the effort that's gone into developing the biological goals and the opportunity today to comment. So the big question is whether the biological goals will enable us to meet the salmon doubling goal. Currently, they're deficient, and if success is measured by achieving goals that are too weak, then it's not true success. We need to ensure steady and rapid improvements to our aquatic ecosystems. I appreciate the emphasis on freshwater survival of juvenile salmon, but the goal isn't ambitious enough. Conditions that lead to extreme mortality in our rivers are solely under the control of water operators on those rivers. They're not influenced by ocean or bay delta conditions. So it's very clear who's responsible for achieving those goals. The water agencies need to take responsibility, and this should have begun decades ago to meet the legal requirements of Fish and Game Code 5937. The goals must be smart and based on science, not wishful thinking. Of course, there will be resistance from water agencies that are averse to change, but this process shouldn't be about assuaging everyone's concerns and reducing the goals to the lowest common denominator. It should be about preserving our Central Valley salmon-based ecosystems. We need ambitious goals that will expedite the revival of the San Francisco Bay Delta, named after St. Francis, the patron saint of animals and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dreckmeyer. Appreciate your contributions and participation in the discussion. It's appreciated. Next, I'd like to call up David Ragland.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. My name is David Ragland. I am an advisor to the Tuolumne River Trust. I live in Tuolumne County, where the water that falls, among other places, on my house generates billions per year in revenues for the water operators. I'd like to see, as we fought so hard for 5 years ago, I'd like to see some more of this water be used for the rivers, for the benefit of the species down there. Something like a real-time reasonable percentage of flows, I think, is critical and key. I'd like to say that I very much appreciate all the work that the board and their staff has done. I particularly wanted to note Mr. Louie's response to comments that flow increases might not help in the Stanislaus, and his diligent work in showing that they would indeed still improve things in the Stanislaus, that other types of non-flow improvements are not sufficient. So I'd like to see this move on. I'm particularly concerned about the 25-year goal checking on the Tuolumne River, where you're talking about a child in a trailer park on the Tuolumne River waiting 25 years, growing up, graduating high school, and getting married before someone can say, gee, you know, those measures we tried didn't quite work. Let's try something else. I think 25 years is too long. So that's one thing I'm concerned about. And finally, the last thing I want to mention that's kind of my 2 cents is we need water all year for not just for biological things, but for human uses too. But because this is a biological meeting, I'll bring that part up. I routinely see Chinook salmon in these lower rivers in January and February. And in rivers that are, you know, conceivably, that's just the species trying to have a variety and a diversity of strategies for survival, but those late ones are being cut off. In rivers that are considered to only have a substantial fall run of salmon, like the Yuba and Feather, they routinely start showing up in July. So we need at least some increase in the water year round. Now, I'd also like to mention that with respect to people speaking against increasing flows can do an inter-river comparison easily. And the Stanislaus, which has mandated flows that are more in line with what the fish need than either the Tuolumne or Merced, routinely has 5 to 10 times the number of Chinook as these other 2 drainages, one of comparable size and one 50% larger. So, and then if we get outside of the one species we've been talking about all day, water year round will help steelhead, will help trout, will help eagles, will help otters, will help beaver. All of these species exist in all 3 of these rivers, and all of them are horrifically stressed when the water is kept to the very low levels. Again, and I know I'm skipping around a lot, but part of the reason I would love to see a real-time percentage is the common and routine switching on and off of the valves that I see, where these rivers change their flow 5, sometimes 10 times in a moment. in an hour. And that's very unnatural. And it causes a stressing and limiting factor, either up or down on the species in question. Again, I appreciate all the work that everyone's been doing on this. I do feel that a lot of the goals are getting closer to each other, that there is agreement on several of them. But when we start talking about not increasing water, I disagree quite strongly. Again, thank you very much. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Ragland. I appreciate your comments today on the work and the project. And just, for what it's worth, for me, it's not an either or. It is the complex interaction between flow and what the natural landscape is that produces what we have. So it's important to keep, for at least me, a mind frame in that vein. So thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break. I know it's a little long, but give us a little time since we won't be taking a lunch, and we'll attempt to get through the rest of our commenters. We have about 8 more. And so let's come back here at 11:25. All right, thank you, everyone. All right, everyone, we are at 11:25. Thanks for everyone for the break. It helps to be able to refresh for a moment so that we can do our best to really listen. So thank you, everyone. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Next, we have up Tim Stroshane, who will be followed by Doug Obiji.
Good day, Chair Esquivel and board members.
Morning. Morning.
I am Tim Stroshane, Policy Analyst with Restore the Delta. RTD is part of a coalition of Delta environmental justice organizations and California Indian tribes following Bay Delta Plan implementation for biological goals about natural salmon production. In the most recent biological goals report that staff put out in April, we appreciate you deleting use of hatchery production data, since in the real world, hatchery fish contribute nothing to meeting the Bay Delta Plan's natural salmon production goals or objective. Thank you for refocusing the biological goals report on natural production and the challenges involved. The biological goals the Water Board adopts must be synergetic. Defining the viability of natural salmon populations should also support and attain doubling of natural salmon production in the San Joaquin River Basin and later the Sacramento River Basin. Viability should not be defined at some low level to undercut the magnitude and attainment of the doubling goal. This is essential to placing natural salmon production on a strong recovery footing, given threats to California rivers from climate change, among other threats they face. RTD helps represent Delta environmental justice communities in our coalition. Our EJ communities, especially youth and young adults who make up 38% of that population, have lost their societal, environmental, and economic connection to healthy migrating salmon runs passing through the Delta. Adhering to the biological goals will realize the salmon doubling objective is part of restorative justice for Delta environmental justice communities that deserve a fully realized connection to public trust resources. Tribal members of our coalition presently engage with the Water Board on establishment of tribal beneficial uses. The Water Board has been bureaucratic in taking up this process and applying it to the Bay Delta estuary and plan. But our coalition is determined to win their application. Such beneficial uses and the water quality and flow objectives needed to achieve and protect them will benefit everyone. They will rely on how and when the board crafts and implements the doubling of natural salmon production for the benefit of all fisheries, tribal and commercial. As a food source, potentially for all human beings, they are rich in proteins, fats, and minerals as part of a healthy diet. We need to irrigate the salmon as much or more than we irrigate almonds, since more salmon can benefit all people right here in California. For the salmon and tribal stewardship of their fishery, time is of the essence to establish the tribal subsistence fishing beneficial use in the Bay Delta Plan so that natural salmon production can fulfill those beneficial uses and benefit others at the same time. The state legislature in 1988 first commanded the meeting of natural salmon production doubling goals in the Fish and Game Code. 35 years later, a meaningful and implementable plan for attaining those goals is long past due. The more juvenile salmon naturally produced by the rivers, the better their chances for navigating the Delta and surviving their ocean lives to escapement from the ocean fisheries and predation to reproduce. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and for considering these comments.
Thank you for the comments, Mr. Stroshane. In contribution to this project, this aspect of the project and the water quality update writ large. Appreciate it. Next, I did say I was going to go to Doug Obiji. I will go to Brett Baker instead. I see your hand up, Mr. Baker, and thanks. I appreciate, thanks for being here on the platform. We'll call you next and then go to Doug Obiji.
We've given Mr. Baker a couple opportunities to unmute.
You may have stepped away here for a moment. And his hand went back down. So
Yeah, I
we'll
took
go ahead and
care
go
of
to Mr. OBG. And Mr. Baker, if you would like to make comment, by all means, just raise your hand back up and we can pull you into the queue. I think.
Good morning, Chair and members. Thank you for the opportunity to provide public comments briefly. My name is Doug Obigi. I'm a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. We greatly appreciate staff's work to refine the proposed biological goals, and particularly the revisions to appropriately exclude hatchery salmon from the calculations consistent with the Bay Delta Plan's objectives. However, there appear to be several elements of the biological goals that need to be revised in order to be consistent with the narrative fish viability objective in the Bay Delta Plan. After all, these goals are supposed to implement the plan's objectives. And it's important to also keep in mind that existing salmon runs on the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced do not appear to be viable populations currently. And that's part of the reason why the board adopted the 2018 amendments to the Bay Delta Plan. The 2018 amendments to the plan should result in significant improvements in the survival and abundance of salmon compared to what we've seen over the last several decades, particularly given the overwhelming scientific evidence that the volume and variability of in-stream flow in the winter and spring months is the primary driver of juvenile salmon survival. It is the limiting factor in most years. So I want to touch on a couple of the goals that we think need to be revised to be consistent with the Bay Delta Plan. First, the proposed freshwater survival goal of 1.5% does not appear to be consistent with a viable fish population, and thus not consistent with the Bay Delta Plan. On page 52 of the 2019 SEP report, they explain that a survival rate of 2.2%, not 1.5%, is the minimum necessary for a resilient population that would be consistent with achieving broader population production targets. The SEP report found that lower freshwater rates like those proposed in the current biological goals would, quote, lead to a situation where low production in one year could severely constrain production in subsequent populations, e.g. the population would not be resilient, end quote. So in our view, the goals need to be revised to include a minimum freshwater survival rate of 2.2% with specific sub-goals for survival to the confluence, survival in the main stem San Joaquin River, and survival through the Delta that achieve the 2.2% survival rate. Second, as a couple other commenters have raised, the time period for achieving some of the biological goals appears to be inconsistent with the Bay Delta Plan and should be revised. For instance, on the Tuolumne River, the draft biological goals are proposed to achieve the salmon escapement goal in 25 years, whereas the escapement goals for the Stanislaus and Merced River would be achieved in 15 years. There's no explanation in the document why we would give the Tuolumne River 10 more years to achieve this biological goal. And in our view, the biological goals should be revised to achieve the target in no less than 15 years, given the ability of salmon populations to increase rapidly with given good conditions. It is achievable. Third, and somewhat relatedly, the draft biological goals for life cycle productivity propose that a cohort replacement rate of at least 1 before fishing would not be achieved for 10 years. And similarly, that the cohort replacement rate of at least 1 after fishing would also not be achieved for at least 10 years. However, that means that the population would not be viable for more than 10 years because an average cohort replacement rate equal to 1 is not a viable population. A viable population should average a CRR or cohort replacement rate closer to 2.5. So we think this goal should be revised to achieve a cohort replacement rate after fishing of greater than 2.5 within 10 years, so that we actually have a viable and resilient population. Fourth, we have concerns that the proposed salmon escapement goals are not consistent with the plan's narrative salmon doubling objective and are looking at the math and the calculations that were done. We will address this issue and some other concerns and questions in our written comments. Finally, and sort of to return to the same theme, we know that existing salmon populations on these tributaries are not viable, and that implementation of the Bay Delta Plan needs to result in significant increases in survival and abundance of salmon compared to the data that we've observed over the last 20 to 25 years. However, at the same time, the data shows that over the past 25 years, these biologicals have been at least occasionally met or exceeded, albeit in the good years. For instance, in the past 25 years, we've observed more salmon return to each of these rivers than the proposed escapement goal. And we've also seen, with respect to the juvenile production and tributary survival goals, that the data shows that at least in the good years, these goals have been achieved or exceeded at least a few times over the last few decades. So these goals are achievable, but they need to be also very result in significant improvements in survival and abundance compared to where we are today if we actually want to have viable salmon populations for future generations to enjoy, for fishing, to sustain fishing jobs, and to sustain the entire ecosystem that depends on marine nutrients brought in by salmon. Thank you to staff for all the hard work on these biological goals and consideration of our comments today.
Thank you, Mr. Obiji. Appreciate the comments and contribution to the discussion. Thank you. Next.
Chair Esquivel, sorry.
Oh, of course, no,
if I could just ask,
Board Member McGuire.
I wanted to ask staff a question because this comment has come up a number of times already today. And so and I'm not exactly clear the rationale. So the comment that we've heard a number of times about the Tuolumne River and the escapement target, and I think some of the other goals being set at 25 years versus the other tributaries being set at 15 years. Could you just, for my own information, explain why those numbers are so different and how that was decided for this plan?
So the population growth rates are based off of the survival goals. And because the Tuolumne River is starting with such a depressed population, even though the doubling of the population is about every 2 generations, it's going to take that much longer to get to meeting their escapement goal because it's just that many more years. If we wanted to, we could require a higher percentage of survival for the Tuolumne if we wanted to have equal timelines for the escapement goal. But just based off of the growth rates with the juvenile survival goals rates or juvenile survival goals, that's how long it's just going to take.
Thank you for that clarification. I understand it's all integrated. If you change one assumption, it will translate into a different outcome. And so I think that's a lot of what we're hearing this morning, and I'm trying to understand. So that having that context really does help for me.
I just wanted to reinforce, like if you pulled up that slide where you see the total juvenile survival, it's 1.5%. So to shorten for the Tuolumne, that would need to be something higher in the 2 range, right? So then you'd have the Stan with 1.5%, the Merced with 1.5%, and the Tuolumne with some higher number in order to make the timing consistent. So we released this appendix that shows all the equations, and that's where you can switch the percentage of juvenile survival and see what happens with the timing. So that's how those are connected.
Really helpful. Thank you. Mr. Obiji, I see your hand up. Did you want to add something further quickly? Should be invited to unmute.
Thank you. I just briefly, I agree with staff, but I think it's important to recognize that if the freshwater survival rate is 2.2 instead of 1.5, so it's consistent with a viable population, you'll see the ability to achieve these longer term escapement targets much more quickly. And as staff explained, all of these goals are supposed to work in tandem. And so I think it is worth doing the math, and we will do this in our comments, of how more quickly you can achieve the escapement target with a 2.2% freshwater survival rate that is actually a viable population rate. Thank you.
Thanks. And obviously here then the balance as we have this discussion is, the other opinions that feel that there's other limiting factors in carrying capacities amongst that. So yeah, appreciate everyone's perspectives here amongst it. And thank you, Mr. Obiji. Next, I'd like to go next to John Rosenfield. Then who will be followed by Conrad Fisher and then Heinrich Albert. Morning still.
Good morning, board members. I'm John Rosenfield, Science Director for San Francisco Baykeeper. I want to thank the staff for their presentation today and their leadership of the STM group, which I'm a part of. As you've heard today, and as you know, the 2018 updates to the Water Quality Control Plan included 2 narrative objectives, salmon doubling and native fish viability for short. The program of implementation must attain those plan objectives. Development of the biological goals are part of the program of implementation. So development of biological goals is not an opportunity to reconsider the plan's objectives or to use the goals as a way to make the objectives easier to attain. It's not an opportunity to relitigate the science, which is well developed regarding flow and native fish productivity. The biological goals do need to be achievable, but that doesn't mean that these targets can be achieved by the current rivers. They can't. That's why we have a plan for improvement here, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that the goals can be achieved by the program of implementation. The goals are here to allow you to evaluate whether the program of implementation is adequate, not the other way around. The Water District needs a comment on the Water District's lengthy presentation here this morning because it misrepresented the SEP report, took it out of context in several places, and it misrepresents the carrying capacity that is needed to attain the viability or doubling plan objectives. There is no expectation and no biological basis for needing habitat that supports 9 million juveniles on the Stanislaus River, which is what I think I heard this morning. Rivers are not hatcheries. To maintain actually viable populations of salmon, the fish must compete with each other. There is no expectation that you will provide room for every egg that returns to the river or every juvenile that hatches from those eggs. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of basic salmon biology. And I'm kind of surprised that it keeps coming up. The biological goals tell us how many juveniles need to exit the system in order to support attainment of the natural production target of the doubling goal. That's the number of fish that you need habitat for. It's not 9 million fish for the Stanislaus River. Also, regarding the Stanislaus, Sturrock et al. Demonstrate that carrying capacity limitations on the Stanislaus are flow dependent. They also showed that the proposed goal for juvenile production from the Stanislaus has been achieved or nearly achieved several times in the recent past. And those targets, that number of juveniles, were attained with fewer adults than the current proposed escapement goals. So, as I was saying, the purpose of the biological goals is to articulate what attainment of plan objectives looks like so that the board can evaluate and adaptively manage the program of implementation. Despite improvements, which I won't have time to go into today, but which I appreciate, the biological goals are still inadequate. For example, as has been mentioned, the proposed goal for overall juvenile survival of 1.5% is arbitrary and is far less than the survival needed to attain viability. The 2019 Stanislaus Scientific Evaluation Process Group, which I was also a part of, found that survival needs to be greater than 2.2% to support and maintain viability of Chinook salmon from the San Joaquin tributaries. And I just want to emphasize here, I don't know what other alternative you all have, because what's the alternative to not maintaining viability of a fish species? It means it disappears in time. I don't think that's actually a tolerable outcome, and I'm sure you agree. Attaining viability will mean that the product of survival rates in the different reaches, the tributaries, the main stem San Joaquin, and the delta must equal or exceed 2.2%. And this will require a higher goal for survival on the tributaries than is currently proposed, especially if the goal for delta survival is only 20%. These numbers just balance out. It's just algebra. They have to multiply out to a number that reflects viability. We've talked about the proposed escapement goals. They're also arbitrary and do not reflect attainment of the plan objectives for doubling natural production. The current escapement goals are calculated as a precondition to achieving plan objectives, assuming survival in various stages is adequate. But the proposed goal for escapement does not reflect actual attainment of the target. It's a step prior to that. It's also redundant of the juvenile production goal that I mentioned before, which uses the same math. It's just further along the path. And the juvenile production target goal that's proposed actually reflects conditions in the river. So the current adult escapement targets really add nothing of value and are likely to distract, as they already are, from measures needed to satisfy plan objectives. Just as an example, we've talked about the Tuolumne River. The escapement goal there basically says that it will take the program of implementation 25 years to achieve something less than the plan objective. This is an unacceptably long delay, and it reflects the inadequate goal for juvenile survival, as we just discussed. I also want to note that the proposed hierarchy of roles that Mr. Louis showed you for different goals on table 1-1 is misleading and incorrectly limits the role of some of the objectives in the board's future consideration of water management. None of these goals are binding. They're all there for your information. There's no reason to limit which goals can be used to provide you with information at this point. For instance, there's no reason that juvenile survival in the main stem San Joaquin should not be considered when evaluating the effect of tributary flows, which create the conditions in the main stem San Joaquin River. We'll have more to say about that in our written comments. In summary then, or finally, I should say, this is the third edition of the biological goals that we've considered and reviewed. And despite improvements, these goals still do not reflect previously published targets for viability and salmon doubling. We're 4.5 years into the plan updates, and no one has yet produced biological goals that are grounded in science that's better than what's found in the SEP 2019 document, or Lindley et al. 2007, or the NIMS recovery plan for Central Valley salmonids. Meanwhile, as you know, many water districts, NGOs, and agencies don't believe that the program of implementation will actually attain plan objectives. So this suggests, as Mr. Bobker did earlier, that as we move forward, the board should adopt biological goals concurrent with the updated standards for the Sacramento River and the Delta. That sequencing would allow the board to use the goals to evaluate alternative programs of implementation before adopting them, rather than needlessly delaying implementation of plan updates while arguing over the definition of success. And that's what we've been doing in phase 1. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenfield. I appreciate your good constructive comments and contributions to this work. Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to call up Conrad Fisher, who will be followed by Heinrich Albert and then Aaron Woolley.
Thank you. Thank you. Conrad Fisher with Water Climate Trust. I just want to speak briefly about the actual goals and then the how and the when they are achieved. The goals overall, as the earlier staff presentation said, are supposed to be science-based and consistent with quote, existing legal requirements. The main legal requirement that was not listed in that slide from staff is the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act requires survival and recovery of endangered salmon. So I will say that the juvenile survival and adult return numbers in these goals are not consistent with the doubling goal, and they're definitely not consistent with the goal of the Endangered Species Act, which again is survival and recovery. Beyond the doubling and beyond the ESA survival and recovery goal, the California Water Board has adopted a racial equity action plan and tribal beneficial use recognition. Both of those, the goals of the racial equity action plan, to the extent they relate to in-stream flows, but certainly tribal beneficial uses of in-stream flows for fish and culture exceed ESA and the doubling goal. So if the Water Board wants to walk its walk on its racial equity goals and tribal beneficial uses, then at the very least you need to achieve ESA survival and recovery. And that will require biological goals that exceed what is currently in the plan for juvenile survival and adult returns. And now just briefly on the how and the when. The SMART acronym is very useful. I'd like to focus on the T. First, time bound. I will reiterate previous comments. 25 years, extending the Tuolumne goals to 25 years is unacceptable. I'm glad that a board member asked this question, but the staff's response, quote, that would require increasing juvenile survival to 2 point somethings, then do it. Like, why not do it to make the timelines consistent? Why is that would require increasing juvenile survival a not acceptable thing to actually do? And then also focusing on the T, it's meant to be time bound, but it should also be linked to triggers for action. What is done, and nothing really in the SMART acronym directly gets at this. We need triggers for action to achieve the goals. And as our previous commenter said, there are many areas where this happens, where biological outcomes are not linked to physical action, and the separation of tributaries to main stem fish numbers and not allowing this to affect, quote, water diversions, water right, water quality, or other actions on the main stem San Joaquin. That's one of many areas where we tend to create lofty goals for ourselves, but not use the power that the water board has to achieve them. So I will just say, let's make these goals stronger. Let's make them so that they achieve the letter intent of the ESA and the water board's intent of tribal beneficial uses and its racial equity action plan. So that will require improving the timelines and increasing the goals for juvenile survival and adult returns. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for yours and participation in this, Mr. Fisher. Thanks for your comments. Much appreciated. Next, I'd like to call up Heinrich Alpert, to be followed by Aaron Woolley and Regina Chicazola.
Thank you very much. This is Heinrich Albert. I'll try to be brief here. I think a number of the commenters have made very good scientifically based evaluation and critiques of the goals as they've been developed so far. I'm going to speak in a little bit different direction, and I just want to say that stopping the decline of California rivers, our fish and the other wildlife that's dependent on those rivers is very important. It's very important to me. It's very important to a great many Californians. And we depend on the water board to protect this public trust resource. We really need you to stand up and defend the resource. I appreciate the efforts to develop these biological goals and the hard work that the staff has done. But it appears to me that it's too little, and a number of people have pointed out the juvenile freshwater survival rate. Seems like it's too little, and it's far below what salmon can achieve when they're not stressed. It's too late in this extremely long timeline, and as the biological goals point out, they lack a regulatory trigger. Delay means denial. I turned 75 this year, and it looks to me like there's not much chance that I'm going to see the objectives met in my lifetime. That's a very sad thing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments. Chair Esquivel stepped out for a moment. He's walking back, but I'll go ahead and move to our next speaker, which is Aaron Woolley.
Good morning, Chair and members of the board. My name is Aaron Woolley. I'm a policy advocate with Sierra Club California. To start, appreciate the work of the board, staff, and the STM working group on the second revised biological goals. The latest version of the goals include some improvements, and I know other commenters have also addressed this, but just want to thank in particular for the changes that now exclude consideration of hatchery origin fish. The plan objectives are specific to doubling natural production and maintaining and supporting the viability of migratory fish, and hatchery origin fish are just not relevant to achieving this goal. And so appreciate that the revised goals addresses this concern. However, further revisions are needed in order to ensure that all of the biological goals reflect attainment of both the salmon doubling and fish viability objectives within a reasonable time frame. I'll keep it brief because other commenters have already addressed many of these points. But to start, the goal for freshwater survival of juvenile salmon is still too low than what is actually necessary to achieve viability. Increased survival compared to current conditions isn't consistent with the attainment of the viability objective, and the goals must achieve the objectives. And so I urge the board to adjust this to 2.2% in order to support and maintain the viability of species long-term. Second, the adult escapement goals don't reflect attainment of the goals and also need to be adjusted. In addition to being redundant of the juvenile production goals, the target timeframes are long. The 25 years on the Tuolumne, which I know has been discussed already, is much longer compared to the other tributaries and needs to be adjusted to reflect the increased survival and population growth. Finally, the proposed hierarchy for the roles of different goals incorrectly limits the role of some of the objectives in the board's future consideration of water management and the tributaries. It's not clear why survival and the main stem shouldn't be evaluated when you're considering the tributary flows or vice versa. I will limit it there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to comment today and look forward to future opportunities for engagement.
I'll likewise look forward to them. Thank you, Ms. Woolley. I appreciate your comments and contributions to this and concerns. Thank you. Next, call up Regina Chicazola, will be followed by Barry Nelson, and I believe our last commenter is Denise Louie. If there's anyone watching or otherwise that has not spoken and is looking to, make sure you make your way onto the platform and board.clerk@waterboards.ca.gov if you're having issues doing so. Ms. Chicazola, good to see you. Good morning still.
Good morning, and thank you for having me today. And I'm glad we're getting through this quickly as I have to be at a school in about 15 minutes. So thank you so much for having me today. There was a lot of things said that I'll try not to repeat, but I just wanted to say that the base of knowledge in this room and Zoom room are incredible. And I really hope that the suggestions made today are incorporated. That said, I really wanted to echo what was said about biological goals needing to be priority really early in the process, because I feel like biological goals should be based on the goals for the whole delta and for all of the tributaries that go into it, because we do want salmon doubling, we want protection of the species, but we also need to start getting back to a fishable, harvestable level for tribes and for fishermen. As you know, as this process has proceeded and sometimes been held up by entities like San Francisco, which I'm extremely ashamed of, being that most people in San Francisco really support this work. In that time, we've killed most of the salmon within our watersheds, and now the fishermen are completely out of business. Tribes within this area don't have much hope for ever having salmon back. You know, we work with a lot of tribes. We work on tribal beneficial uses for the entire delta. And people are losing hope. They're losing their jobs. They're losing the ability to practice their culture and support their families. And I think we need to make sure we start going into these processes, looking at biological goals, looking at the people who are the most dependent on the watersheds. So I probably won't focus a whole lot on the science because everything that was said was so important. I do think we need to be very careful about looking at trying to obtain our goals for salmon in a way quicker timeline, because we are looking at possible extinction here, and we are looking at people losing their entire livelihood. So saying we're going to get to it in 25 years, I believe goes against the racial equity plan. I believe it goes against our promises to our fishermen, and I believe it goes against the truth and healing process to not treat this as the emergency that it is. So that was the main things that I wanted to say today. The last thing I wanted to say is, I know Tim brought up before that we are part of a coalition that deals with EJ communities in the Delta and tribes. And I wanted to say that I think anything that happens that benefits the salmon also benefits water quality for the people. Of course, we represent salmon people, you know, the tribes and the fishermen, but people within the Delta and within the San Joaquin River are also dealing with the terrible environmental effects that come from pollution and lack of flows. So I just always want to bring it back to the point that we need to save the salmon. We need to meet these doubling goals. We need to protect our fishermen. We need to protect our tribes, but we also need to protect these communities within the cities that are the losers from the state and federal water projects. You know, maybe some of the winners could be said that they are people like San Francisco that are able to take clean water from high up in the watersheds. from areas where tribes were moved out of their homelands to build those giant reservoirs. But the losers are people in places like Stockton and the tribes that have been moved off their land. And a lot of these folks are putting incredible energy into restoration projects and into organizing and into pollution controls. But none of those things mean anything without flows and without water. Restoration projects will never help the salmon without the water to actually help them. So those things said, I look forward to working with you on this more. I look forward to working with you on phase 2 in restoring the entire Delta, San Francisco Bay, and San Joaquin River watersheds. And I will pass it on to the next person now.
Thank you, Ms. Chickazzola. I appreciate your contributions here and agree with you that we're all intricately tied together by our watersheds and our usage, and appreciate the contributions to this project. Next, I'd like to call up Barry Nelson, and our last speaker at this point, I believe, will be Denise Louie.
Thank you, Chair Esquivel and board members. Barry Nelson, representing the Golden State Salmon Association. I'm really pleased that I'm following Regina's comments and want to reinforce those comments regarding impacts on tribal people and on the fishing community. GSSA represents the fishing community very broadly across California. And I just want to highlight in this context, it's important that we ground this conversation in the reality of what's happening on the ground. Really catastrophic impacts on tribal people and on people who depend on the fishing economy this year with the current shutdown. Population of Fall Run and the Sac River is one of the lowest ever. Just in the last couple of days, I've gotten some preliminary reports on spring run populations for this year, and those populations are catastrophically low. These aren't final counts yet, but the initial counts are catastrophically low and possibly the lowest levels we've ever seen. It is absolutely critical, given the impacts that we're seeing to the species, to the ecosystem, and to the people who depend on those species, that the board make aggressive, ambitious revisions to this document and update and finalize the whole plan and implement it as rapidly as possible. I'd like to, my comments will be brief. I'm going to highlight a couple of aspects of issues you've already had a number of speakers touch on. First, I want to state that we're pleased that this current document is moving away from a vague discussion of trends with more of a focus on hard numbers that can represent true SMART goals. The challenge now is making sure we have the right numbers. So I want to just highlight 3 particular ones and each of them has been mentioned. First is the overall 1.5% juvenile freshwater survival goal. That's clearly low when you look across the range of Chinook. That's dramatically lower, almost an order of magnitude lower than average. But I do want to make sure that you note that the impact you got from the scientific community, the input you got from the scientific community, was that the number used should be 2.2, at least 2.2 or higher. And I just want to note here that in regulatory processes, we far too often aim at the least protective, vaguely credible number. And that is not likely to succeed here in a system as dynamic and changing as this, where we know we need to expect changes. We know we need to expect the unexpected. And in situations like that, leaving no margin for error and aiming for the weakest credible number is often aiming for failure. So it's absolutely critical that the board focus on an overall juvenile survival level of 2.2 or higher. We need to build in some margin for error for the ecosystem, because so far we've seen clearly if there's no margin for error, then what we wind up with is failure. Second is the timeline on the Tuolumne. The Tuolumne has when you look at progress over the last 30 years, the Tuolumne River has the worst record in the Bay Delta watershed, and asking them to work harder, given that poor record over the next 15 years or so, is perfectly reasonable, given the poor performance over the last 25 years. We urge you not to delay that timeline further. We've already seen achieving doubling delayed by decades already. A 25-year timeline for the Tuolumne is simply not reasonable. And it's, as Dogobiji mentioned, with a more realistic juvenile freshwater survival goal, that doubling goal can be achieved, and viability goal can be achieved far earlier. If we give these fish decent conditions, they're not going to need more than 8 generations to rebound. And the last one is a comment about table 1.1 in your document, and that is the table that, to my surprise, when I looked at it, and from our perspective, inappropriately limits the use of biological goals before the board. We believe that all of these biological goals should be available to be considered by the board when making important decisions about water diversions, water rights, water quality, and so forth. Constraining the use of those biological goals in that setting, we think is inappropriate. We'd urge you to make the 3 changes I've just walked through, as well as a number of others that my NGO colleagues have recommended. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Appreciated the comments and contribution here to the work. Thank you. And last, I'd like to call up Denise Louie.
And Chair Esquivel, Denise has unmuted, but I'm not seeing any indication that her microphone is picking up any audio.
Yeah, and Ms. Louie, in case, what sometimes happens is the wrong microphone can get selected. And so on the Zoom platform, there's a little caret next to the microphone, and you may be able to select a different microphone if you are speaking and we just can't hear you.
I'll also point out we have given Ms. Louie an opportunity to start her camera, and I haven't seen that go on as well.
Okay.
In the meantime, if she wants to continue attempting to connect, she can, but we also do have Mr. Baker's hand up.
Thank you. Mr. Baker and Ms. Louie, again, you may want to try to adjust and try to select a different microphone. We'll be able to hear you once you do pop on, so just keep trying. And then until then, Mr. Baker, thank you. Good to see you.
Chair Esquivel, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to present some comments here today. We'll also be submitting some written statements and written comments on the 12th. My name is Brett Baker. I represent the Central Delta Water Agency. And I just wanted to throw it out there that in my past life, I was a fisheries biologist. And I want to thank all the other fisheries biologists for detailed and thoughtful comments today. Without getting into those details, so I just wanted to throw out a few overarching issues and goals that we have with this plan, and just want to remind the board of some of their obligations and where these obligations lie and what we're trying to recoup here for the on behalf of Californians. So our comments start out with that the board has seemingly lost their direction to preserve, enhance, and restore the quality of Californians' water resources on behalf of Californians. And I guess it depends on your interpretation of which Californians we're protecting and benefiting and enhancing. But I think Mr. Nelson touched on it briefly. What we end up with in a lot of these programs and plans is we set objectives and goals, and they're minimum standards, they're low standards. And so what we end up doing is we aim too low, and then we end up shooting ourselves in the foot. I think we should aspire more to aim for the moon. Maybe we'll hit the stars. The board and has continually shown a pattern and practice of relaxing water quality standards and removing these goals and obligations on the project to mitigate their impacts from their operations and place that burden on others in the watersheds, and particularly and those in watersheds of origin. We think that part of the issue here is the scope in which you're looking at the San Joaquin River. You too heavily rely on the Stanislaus. You don't include Friant and Kings portions of the San Joaquin. So I think that those are things that can be improved going forward. And yeah, I would just say that when you're looking at these fisheries objectives, these are in addition to water rights and water supply objectives, water quality objectives in the Delta. Those are above and beyond. So we need to account for all of these things. I'm not downplaying any of the issues that were brought up here today, but we need to make a plan to get through a series of dry years. We still have not shown an ability to navigate a 6-year dry spell. Yeah, fortunately, we haven't had that presented to us all at once, but we need to have a plan to do that and take care of the fish and the natural resources that rely on these systems during those periods. So all in there, we'll have sufficient comments to submit on the 12th as well. But I just want to throw all that into the mix. You guys have a tough job. Don't get me wrong.
I appreciate that, Mr. Baker. We all collectively do. These aren't easy issues, and just appreciate the contributions, both from yourself and everyone here in today's comments. Let's try to go back to Denise Louie. I believe she has her hand up. And again, Ms. Louie, it's showing that you are currently unmuted, but if you're speaking, regrettably, your audio is not coming through currently.
So one possibility, Ms. Louie, is to try again what Chair Esquivel had suggested, which is on your Zoom application, there is a little caret or up arrow that's right next to the microphone in the lower left. And if you click on that, not on the microphone, but on the up arrow, there may be another input device you can choose. Another option is in the link that was sent by the clerk, there's also a phone number. And if you have access to your cell phone or another phone, you could try to dial in quickly and then we could patch you into the meeting that way. That will be in the outbound email that would have come from the board clerk.
Hopefully, yeah, if it's looking like the Zoom platform isn't working well for you, Ms. Louie, go ahead and try calling in. And we'll proceed to some discussion here, but we can still take your comment. And so we'll watch for you to call in on the platform. Thank you. We heard a lot. I just, again, at the top, want to thank everybody for the engagement around this, both in the STEM group officially and then here in this public workshop. This is a workshop, so we're not voting on anything. There's no decisions that we're making here. This was meant to further unpack what is, again, not an uncomplex set of issues, but that I've really appreciated seeing here further refinement toward a product that I think that folks can have some faith in. I know that here, as you can hear from the comments that we've heard, from the responses that we've had, even to much of what we've been hearing, we are trying to get that right balance. I think it is here about achievability, yes, as part of our smart framework, but important that we don't here wed ourselves to the current conditions and say, well, here's what current conditions have been able to somehow demonstrate, and that's the ceiling by which we're approaching this project. These are goals, and I think just for that, meant to, in fact, stretch us and here achieve something that we're actively trying to through the project, and in a way that I hope everyone continues to have good faith here at the board that we're trying our best to synthesize what are not uncomplex issues, but we need to do this work. This work for me is so critical because I hear it in this dialogue that we have before us and over again within not just the Bay Delta, but our watersheds across the state writ large, where we are reconciling and trying to really evaluate for the first time in the history of this state, what do we need to keep within our watersheds to support them? And the work comes at a real critical time, and especially the development of the biological goals for me is an opportunity to have a common reality, have a common set of facts and data that we are here all hopefully agreeing is our best chance at seeing in common at least this system if not to continue to find ways to see the actions that we need to take in common, because I think we all agree on writ large the outcomes. But it's really a matter of this difference of opinion, I feel, ultimately around achievability. And I think we want to strike the right balance here where this is pushing us, and it's not about wedding us to what our circumstances we've already said aren't adequate. So thank you. I appreciate a lot of the back and forth. I think for me, understanding ultimately the production goals that we're looking to, the rearing goals we're looking to meet. I am looking to be a little more aggressive, I think, a bit within this. And especially, the comments around the Tuolumne and its treatment different, trying to figure out how best to reconcile that, I think for me is a little worthwhile. So I'll be interested in further discussing that and appreciate the feedback that we've heard today. I'm going to look to fellow board colleagues if they have any other specific questions or comments they'd like to make here right now. And again, for everyone, this is a workshop, so we're not deciding anything here, and just appreciate everyone's great engagement. It's been a really good morning.
I'll go ahead and go.
Board Member McGuire, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So I just want to thank all the commenters today. I really appreciate the input. Obviously, there's still a variety of different perspectives out there in terms of what and how these biological goals have been established. And I think that's in no small measure reflected by the fact that we've had now 3 versions of these goals. And it sounds like there's still quite a bit of divergence in terms of where those should be, where those should land appropriately. So I think, though, thinking back over the last few months, I think establishment of the STEM working group and engagement through that process has been incredibly helpful and valuable in providing useful information here to update the goals. So what I've seen is a lot of positive progress in terms of refining them, making sure that there's a better sense of agreement in so much as how the goals have been established. And so I feel like we're getting closer and closer and closer to that point where we can be comfortable moving forward with what will be a decision point to have a starting point, because this is going to be an adaptive process. We're going to learn. We're still at the beginning stages of implementing the Bay Delta plan. There's a lot of work to come here. So I don't know if we need to have a lot of back and forth today, but I was writing down some of my questions and thoughts as the comments were being shared, and also staff's presentations today. And a lot of it does go to achievability. And it's 2 questions. One is, what do we want to achieve broadly for these watersheds, for these rivers, for our salmon, our fish? I think we can agree we want viability. I think those goals, those objectives are laudable and should be the focus. But the other part of the question is then what's achievable under the board's authority, and what's achievable under the decision that the board made in 2018 to establish the flows that it did, right? And that's where it becomes incredibly difficult to untangle that. And I feel like that's where we're feeling the tension in terms of what's reasonable to expect that we'll achieve from the board's actions that are within our control, and then what are all the other factors? What are those limiting factors? What are those stressors? What are those other things that may preclude achievement of any of these individual metrics? And then clearly some of the concern I think we may hear from water users, and I'm looking forward to the comment letters being submitted in a couple weeks, may speak to that, and it reflects then all of the assumptions that we make. So there's a lot of discussion about survival rates and what the appropriate freshwater survival rate is, and I have in no part in my life have ever been a fisheries biologist, so I can't weigh in on that number. But what I'm interested in is what's ultimately, what's a reasonable, what do we need to achieve in a tributary and in the watershed holistically, and then what's reasonable to expect that we can achieve from our actions under the authority of the board. And those are the two pieces of information that, for me will help with my comfort level in terms of making a decision on these goals going forward, and being mindful of the fact, Chair Esquivel, to your point about the relationship here with these goals and also the broader Sacramento Bay Delta goals, when those are established, that this is an important point in time. And I agree. I think once these goals and the approach to them are set, there's a strong likelihood that this same approach might then translate to the rest of the watershed. So I want to make sure that we have comfort in how these are being established and how then they might extend more broadly. The other piece I wanted to mention is just on that is not clear to me from the goals report yet, but I think is important to provide some clarity on is what parameters we currently understand and monitor and measure, and what ones we don't. One piece when I'm reading the report and as I've been thinking about the goals and all of the commenters providing their input, I don't have a good sense of the baseline. For example, we learned today that the survival rate on the Tuolumne for juveniles is quite a bit lower than the other tributaries. Well, for me, that's just a relative comparison. I don't have the numbers to say, and I know you have a lot of those data in some cases, but I think we don't have explicit monitoring established in all of these tributaries to track all of these goals and parameters. So my thoughts about the fact that this is, at some point we have to put our pencils down and say, this is as much as we know. The work then begins to collect all the monitoring data to fill the gaps that we currently have, and then figure out where we are with that data, and then adaptively manage from there. So, I would be interested either in the report or sometime maybe in a briefing or other discussion, just to have a better sense for our baseline and our starting point today, because I think it's easy to confuse all of these assumptions. And one thing I've learned about all of this is that they're also interrelated. As you look at stock recruitment models and different parameters, and I think your addition of the appendices to include all the assumptions and the calculations is also another really helpful step to show our work. But I think, adding to our understanding of where we are currently today and what we think we can achieve by what time is going to be helpful in adding some confidence to this document. But again, appreciate all the work and the input today. Thanks.
Thank you, board member. Good points and appreciate them. Before we get further comments, we do have Denise Louie, I believe, joined by phone now, so we can take her comment.
And Miss Louie,
Okay.
there you go.
Hello.
There we
Good
are.
afternoon.
Okay, good
Yeah,
afternoon.
thank you. Thanks for sticking with us. Appreciate it.
Yes, I've been on since 9:30.
Yeah.
Okay, so first, I want to acknowledge all the work that you have done at the state level. And as a San Franciscan, I'm really ashamed that what the PUC has done with its lawsuits. And I was in Sacramento at the board meeting in 2018. And I remember saying time is of the essence. Well, it's been 5 years since then. And and before that, it took 10 years to get the Bay Delta plan out. I just think we've been waiting too long, and what we've been doing isn't working. So why keep doing it? We need to change the freshwater flows. So please, I strongly urge you to do whatever's necessary, even if it's only temporary, to increase those freshwater flows. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Louie. I really appreciate your comments and contribution here, and again, sticking with us on this item. Look forward to your continued contributions here. So thank you. Okay. I think that, and at this point, if anyone is on the platform or hasn't spoken, please do raise your hand. But look to fellow board colleagues, board member Firestone.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And echo the thanks to staff and stakeholders and the STM group for getting us where we are. And I think we're all anxious to get this over the finish line. And there is a ton of agreement. Two things I wanted to hit on that I heard. One was just maybe if staff can clarify a little bit in table 1.1 on the role and use of the biological goals. I heard some question around whether the especially the juvenile survival goals for the main stem in particular might be relevant to thinking about approving adaptive implementation adjustments for the tributaries. And it seems to me that it might be in terms of things like scheduling or timing and other things. And I just wouldn't want us to limit unnecessarily consideration of goals that really are relevant to thinking about how best to do adaptive implementation. So I'm wondering if you can speak to just the interpretation of table 1 and how we use the different goals to help think about adaptive management.
Absolutely, I can help out with that one. The table 1 really speaks to a part of the program of implementation that identifies 2 criteria that need to be met in order for the board to allow for adaptive implementation. The numeric objective has a default setting of 40% of unimpaired flow as a 7-day running average. Then in the program of implementation, there are essentially like 3 adaptive implementation options: how to change within the required percent of unimpaired flow, how to not use the 7-day running average, but use a water budget approach, which is estimating the 5-month volume from January to June and identifying an alternative flow schedule that distributes that volume over the 5 months. Then the third one is just a slight variation of the second one, which is taking some portion of that volume and using it in a time period outside February through June. In those cases where you're talking about the flow budget, or I guess actually in all 3 of those cases, it applies to all 3. There are 2 criteria that the board needs to meet that would allow either the executive director to approve an alternative flow schedule or a change in the required percent of unimpaired flow. The first one is essentially meeting the narrative objective. So will the alternative flow schedule, will the adjustment, will it be sufficient to support and maintain natural production of native viable San Joaquin River watershed fish populations migrating through the Delta? It doesn't mean it has to meet that right now. It means that the proposed change will do that in the future. And you have scientific information, best available scientific information to show that. So you need that information in order for the board to be allowed to make that change. The second criteria is that the change will meet any existing biological goals approved by the State Water Board. That one has some, ambiguity about it. What does any mean? Does it mean all of them? Does it mean just one of them? So what we tried to do in table 1 was make it clear that it would be the juvenile biological goals that are part of that second criteria. It doesn't mean that once the 2 criteria are met, any of the information from the biological goals can help make a decision about what is the right change in the required percent of unimpaired flow, what is the right flow schedule, what is the best alternative flow schedule. They are the use of juvenile goals and information about juvenile goals. The clarity that was provided in table 1 was that they would be used for evaluating whether or not those criteria have been met. That allows the board to move off the 7-day running average and into one of those alternative implementation options.
Sorry, that's really helpful. Do you mind clarifying though, wouldn't we want to look at then whether the adjustments that we'd be approving are enabling us to meet the juvenile goals in the main stem?
So we applied this to the tributaries because the alternative flow schedules would impact the tributaries most quickly. So let's say you are meeting your biological goals, or you have sufficient information that says you should meet them in the main stem, you're meeting the flows, in the tributaries, and you're meeting the flows in the tributaries. Then those flows move into the main stem. So once they're in the main stem, if the flows are remaining in the main stem, and we would need to confirm that, so the flows aren't, being like diverted for other purposes, then I think the point is to find another tool to make sure flows stay in the main stem, or there's some other issue going on that means that the fish leaving the tributaries and moving through the main stem are experiencing some other stressor that isn't related to the flows moving them out. So it's to try to isolate that situation and make it clear that if the flows are at the right place and right time as they're supposed to be, and we're meeting juvenile production targets, then we need to look for what else is happening in the main stem that might not be a function of those two.
So I'm following that. The piece that I understood being raised that I am not following is if we're seeing that one or more, all of the tributaries could move to the timing to be outside of that period, then collectively, shouldn't we also be, before we would want to approve that, don't we need to look at what the implications are for that cumulatively in terms of whether we're able to meet the objectives in the main stem? In other words, it's not just we're going to assume if you're meeting, the percent unimpaired flow, then there's other considerations in terms of, is that water staying in the main stem? I think what I'm trying to say is, isn't it relevant for us to be looking at whether we're able to meet the main stem as we are approving some of these pretty fundamental changes in each of the tributaries that kind of cumulatively may result in not being able to meet the main stem? Am I missing something? That's sort of the niche that I'm not seeing why we would want to limit. What it seems like that is relevant for us to be considering when we're approving changes.
We did receive that comment, and you heard it, I think, a few times today. And in one of our STM meetings, we had the question of like, well, then, what would be the suggestion? And would the suggestion be to basically add the goals that are in row 2 just to row 1, so that they're all considered together? That's an option that can be considered. I think part of the idea just on the tributary part is that that's where we have known monitoring, and we know that we can identify, well, we don't have it everywhere. Speaking to Sean's point, I don't think we don't have paired rotary screw traps on the Merced, but the idea would be to be able to do this, we would need that. So assuming we get paired rotary screw traps on each river and we can identify survival on each of the tributaries, then we have the information we need. Right now, it's not clear the design that we would need on the main stem San Joaquin to be able to collect that information. Like, that's still work that we have yet to do. There is monitoring at Mossdale, just downstream of the Vernalis. Tends to get the larger size classes. It's not really designed for fry. So there are monitoring and assessment and design things we need to figure out still.
Okay, thanks. That's super helpful.
Check with Steve and see if he has anything to add. Do you know? Okay, all right.
Okay, and that also goes to, I think maybe Board Member McGuire's point on just making sure that obviously we all are really anxious to make sure that we have the ability to measure these things that we're and that's part of, at least my understanding is that's part of this, is getting those set and then making sure that we're able to, that we are measuring them so that we can assess them.
Absolutely. There is a distinction between the goal setting process, and then it's a second step to make sure that we have monitoring, assessment, reporting, and whatever science we need to do in terms of special studies. That would be a subsequent step. We do have a lot of monitoring in the system, but I wouldn't say we have everything that we need.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll just say on that point, I don't know what the right, I'm not going to advocate here on exactly what the right approach would be, but it does seem like although the tributaries don't have full control over reaching the biological or, these biological goals on the main stem, the adaptive implementation adjustments that we'd be approving are directly relevant to those. And so I wouldn't want to limit our ability or the need. I think we should recognize that we should be looking at that as we're making those approvals. And there may be a reason to consider that in a slightly different way because of those differences. But I think that's a helpful comment that I hope folks will flesh out in their comments. The other point that I think other board members have also spoken to on the difference with the Tuolumne in terms of 25 years and the percent for survival rates. It definitely seems to me that what we want to be doing, that what we've already done is identify, we have objectives. We have looked at what the science points to achieve those objectives, and what we've adopted in the plan and program of implementation is what we think will get us to those objectives. And so, and I don't think there is a differentiation to say, well, one tributary has to get to those objectives in 25 years and another tributary, the other two in 15 years. I think the expectation was that this will get us to those objectives. And so if the rate for juvenile survival in order to meet those objectives on the Tuolumne needs to be higher, in terms of what it will take to meet the objectives, then I think that that's what we should be evaluating in terms of the success of this program and program of implementation and plan that we've adopted. And I think it's important to differentiate between, this is not a numeric standard, as we've said. This is very much are we on track, and are we is what we've adopted going to get us where we think it, or where the objectives are, and be successful with what we intended or understood would happen. So I do think that's we should relook at that timeline and allow for adjustments to that target or a goal for the Tuolumne if it needs to be higher in order to be more consistent with the other tributaries. But I look forward to comments on that. I think obviously we want things that are achievable, but I also think that we did balance that when we adopted the program of implementation. That's where we really set what we thought was reasonable protection. And so that's not something that we now relitigate in setting different goals. I think those were the two issues that I heard that I wanted to follow up on. And I also will just say there's so many, I think, great meeting of the minds in terms of what we're trying to do here that weren't there before. And so this has just been a really successful process. And I appreciate staff's work on that, and then all the stakeholders, so that, you know, we still aren't, and we may never be perfectly in meeting of the minds, but I think in terms of our collective understanding of what we're trying to achieve, that's what really this is valuable for, and is needed, and is going to help us all be successful. Thanks.
You're here. Really appreciate everyone's valued contributions. And thank you, board member, for the good comments. Vice Chair.
All right. Well, thank you all for the participation today, and for participation that many that spoke today were participated all the way through. And I just really appreciate the improved tone, and obviously we still don't have a total meeting of the minds, but it's just really reassuring to see movement in general with respect to these issues. So first of all, I just want to focus a bit on the influence of hatcheries. And I think that the document has vastly improved in that area, in that we're not actually, you know, relying on hatcheries for these numbers, because we're trying to get an increase in native populations. But the influence is still there. And so just looking for how the biological goals, whether it's through the biological goals or through the program of implementation with respect to the important role that the Bay Delta Plan can play with respect to other agencies. And so just looking for on this issue of tagging, if we can get additional, see what can be done to increase the percentage for tagging, and then also responsiveness in terms of the reports that come back, because I think all of that can really help to feed into this important information that's going to be collected. And then I know my colleagues have already spoken about monitoring, but again, just looking for where we can get improvements in monitoring. I know, Ms. Forsman, you brought up the Merced. That's, you know, one area that is troubling, because we don't have the monitoring there on the Merced that we do on these other tributaries. So looking for improvements in the monitoring, and then also to receive that information in a timely basis. And then speaking of timeliness in getting information back, looking for what commitment can be made, whether, I don't know that it needs to be in the biological goals, but maybe in the resolution that we adopt, or, you know, it's already in the Bay Delta Plan and in the program of implementation. But I'm looking to, I think it's important for this group to continue to meet, because every voice is an important voice. And as long as the group is productive, I think that it will really help us to you know, improve the goals themselves, and then also the options for adaptive management, and looking for the appropriate role for our board in ongoing reports with respect to the information as it comes in, hopefully in a timely manner, because, you know, this is, you know, it's important that we see early on, you know, how things are going. And then lastly, with respect to the issue of achievability with respect to the SMART, the way that the goals have been outlined, I continue to have concerns about achievability. And I agree with board member McGuire, you know, there's achievability in terms of, you know, what's aspirational and what's possible. But then there's achievability with respect to the specific actions that we have that are, you know, the flow related actions for these tributaries. And so I think it's always important to be able to distinguish between those two. And I think that I just want to compliment the staff, because I think that in table 1, I think you're trying to thread that needle. And I think that it will be important for us to kind of keep our eye on what is actually achievable with respect to the actions that are being taken in their tributaries. And then once the flow leaves the tributaries, there's all kinds of there's stressors in the system, even within the tributaries, but then so much more so after the water leaves the tributaries. And so to the extent that you're able to improve upon that in the final document that comes before us, I think that would be helpful. And then for us to be always looking at all these different dynamics that are at play, and where there would be some role for us, changing the biological goals based upon additional information that we receive. I think the best example of that is, my growing understanding of, juvenile production as compared to escapement. And, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't follow escapement, but juvenile production, as you've indicated here in table 1, is really really something that the tributaries can have much more control over as compared to escapement. It doesn't mean we shouldn't look at escapement. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some targets there. But in terms of any changes to adaptive management, the focus on production seems to be very well placed. And again, thank you all. I think we had a really good discussion today, and I look forward to reading the comment letters.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I agree. It was a really good discussion. I appreciate everyone's contributions, board members, and of course the participants, both in the STEM and then here in today's forum. It's again, I'm feeling more comfortable that we're getting to a place where, again, there's not everyone agrees on everything, but I'm feeling comfortable with this document having the right balance here amongst it. And I think that I'll just emphasize, I know it's a point that's been made, that we don't have our yet real full grasp on what data we do have that complements the goals, and what additional data and or infrastructure we'll need for monitoring to get there. It'd be nice to have some idea of that as we come into the summer and we adopt, and already start on that next step, because I feel that looming certainly amongst this, because for all the good work to try to get this right, absent really having the data then to and still maybe being years off from developing a lot of it, starts to give me some anxiety amongst it still. So if we can, to the extent that we can begin to have a sense of that as we come into the summer, I think it would be helpful as these are finalized. Any other comments from folks? And then otherwise, I think there's some next steps we can make sure we leave everyone with the workshop on, and then can transition out. Hearing none. And if there was anything you all heard that you wanted to make comment, by all means, welcome it. Yeah, and we'll just bring back up the slide.
Yeah, could we bring back up the presentation just on the last slide, and then.
Thanks, everyone. Just taking a moment to bring up the next step slide. While we're waiting, Tim, Mr. Stroshan, you have your hand up? Want to make one final point?
Yeah, it's not a point. It was a request. I wanted to find out if the staff presentation from this morning will be available to the public.
Yes, thank you. We will make sure that is posted on the site. And trying to think, where on the site will it be, just so we can go ahead and direct folks?
With the biological goals?
Well, we can probably put it in the FTP folder. Plus, this video will also be available.
Okay, let's try to get it somewhere, on the website, and then okay, we'll put it on our San Joaquin site. Sounds like on the website, so hopefully folks can easily find that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you as well.
Okay, so as we've heard before, written comments on the second revised draft initial biological goals report are due May 12th. It's a week from Friday. After we receive the comments, we'll evaluate comments and the input that we got here today and produce a draft final initial biological goals report. And then as soon as this summer, we'll bring it to the board for consideration.
And the release of that final draft, just so, I mean, it'll depend on what all we receive and written comment, how long it takes us to respond. We want to give everyone good, attention to that. But are we, is it July or, what kind of time frame might, in late summer, early fall? Okay. Just, I know there's a lot going on and I want to make sure everyone is able to kind of time out, their engagement on this. So that's helpful then. Thank you. I appreciate that finer point. Anything further from any colleagues? Okay, thank you. It has been a really great workshop. I appreciate everyone's time and attention and two-day board meeting. This concludes item number 9 here today, and importantly concludes our board meeting as well. Our next board meeting will actually be May 16th and 17th. It will not be here, and it will be just focused actually on the Salton Sea. So we will all be down in Brawley here in 2 weeks. Look forward to seeing everyone there. And again, that board meeting here, once people see the agenda come out, it will just be focused here largely on the Salton Sea. So all of our regular items will be pushed into June. So we will see you all in 2 weeks in Brawley. Until then, be safe, be well. Thanks everyone for the great meeting, and we'll see you very soon. Take care. This meeting is officially adjourned. Thank you.